Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year. I haven't seen you all, so I get to say Happy New Year to everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Before we began, however, Ms. Brownlee isn't here, but I just wanted to thank her in her absence for presiding over the meetings while I was away. While I was away, I realized the same as all of you all that we've been through some tough times over the last couple of years, and so we have to make some tough decisions. I don't believe that there is a light at the end of this tunnel right now, but I'm optimistic that there will be because we're going to work very hard at it, and if we all work together, I think we can come up with some solutions. While I was away, I did talk to a lot of education people, and I think now we're worn down so much that everyone is kind of willing to work together to come to a solution, and we're back to thinking of our young people as the ones that we're working for, the next generation, and we're taking self out of it and coming around to saying that we have to step up to the plate and provide for the next generation. And so I'm really optimistic about finding solutions to some of our financial problems. But until then, though, we'll have to make some difficult decisions, and we'll have to consider further reductions to education. I think it is important for our subcommittee to understand the everyday impacts of our decisions at the local level. Hi, Mr. Swanson, how are you? Thank you. Before we consider cutting more, however, we have to stop and think how much have we already cut. We have 6 issues on the agenda this morning, but first we will hear from our Superintendent of Public Instruction, Mr. Jack O'Connell, and following Mr. O'Connell will be Catherine Gator, Undersecretary in the Office of the Secretary of Education. We're so happy to have her this morning. And so if we could begin with Mr. O'Connell, we're just really excited to have you. We have our members here, so let me just call the roll, please.
Assemblymember Carter.
Here.
Berryhill. Here. Brownlee. Chesbrough. Fuller. Swanson.
Present.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good to see you. It really is.
Thank you.
Enjoyed chatting with you earlier. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come by and share a few ideas and thoughts with you and the entire committee. You have an impressive agenda and a analysis, as I mentioned to you. It's very well written, and it was very helpful, I think, for a lot of folks that are going to be testifying before you here today. As an elected state superintendent of public instruction, I do have an opportunity to meet with a host of groups relating to education, particularly a lot of teachers, teacher organizations, parent organizations, administrators, and they were in town yesterday. And students, obviously, as we saw in the Capitol the last couple of weeks as well, and really the entire educational community. And I have to tell you that during the last couple of years, it's really been a much more somber tone. People realize the difficult atmosphere that they're working in, the difficult atmosphere that we are all working in. And I almost beginning to feel a sense of despair amongst many. And I think the reason is relatively simple, and it has been, quite frankly, the devastating cuts that they have been that they've had to impose on programs that they know work. School board members that are making decisions based exclusively almost on fiscal considerations, not on educational considerations. We're looking at, over the last 2 years, the schools operating on $17 billion less than they had anticipated just 2 years ago. And we have an itemized breakout to arrive at that figure. If you want, I'd certainly be happy to share it with you. So I think my message here today is pretty simple. And the message is that our educational delivery system simply cannot continue to afford to take the massive cuts that education has been forced to take. No longer can we expect our schools to continue to try to do more with less. Today, it's a matter of our schools trying to keep the lights on. It's a matter of survival. We all know we're going to have fewer school counselors, school librarians, fewer nurses. We're going to have fewer teachers, and I'll talk in a second about yesterday, the March 15th deadline. We see in our schools today fewer classes in the arts, in music, career technical education, something that we've done a lot in, and the governor's been very supportive and very helpful, as has the legislature. Sports programs being eliminated or fees being imposed on students to participate. Bus rides are longer. In fact, I was speaking to a group of Rotarians in Ventura County a couple of months ago, and I said, yeah, bus rides are going to be longer. And the superintendent, Santa Paula, I think a mutual friend of ours, jumped up and said, Jack, just want to tell you, we've eliminated all bus service together in a rural community. And you wonder what that's going to do to just getting kids to school when we're trying to combat the dropout rate, which is a top priority for many of us. Summer school, take a look at last summer. Scaled back virtually every single district, if not totally eliminated. And I'm going to predict right now you're going to see more of the same, this coming summer. The school year being shortened as well. This is a time when the president is calling for a longer school year, longer school day for our students, and we're going the opposite direction. In fact, you look at all 50 states, 44 of the 50 states go at least 180 days, and some even longer. And we're going the opposite direction. And then when you look at the more industrialized countries in the world, 3/4 of them go much longer than 180 days, some as many as 220, even 240 days. And we're going backwards, sliding back to 175 days. And then class sizes, the largest I've ever seen, really K through high school. And I'm one that believes, class size reduction actually works. And I know that's one of your topics for discussion, the impacts on the budget. For that as well. And we've had studies. The landmark study was out of Tennessee years ago, where they believed the ideal was 15 students to 1. And then just this past year, one of the Big Ten schools, I can't remember if it was Michigan or Purdue, I read it about a year ago, and their conclusion that class size reduction works, not just while the students are in that small class, but even ongoing on a longitudinal basis, the benefits during those early formative years, so that the students have a more individualized, personalized instruction. And then yesterday, Madam Chair, as you know, was the pink slip day for the preliminary notification of our certificated personnel if they're not going to be retained for next year. Last year, a little bit of historical perspective, we had 26,000, and the school districts are not required to report this to us, nor to you, nor to the governor, but when in our polling, calling around and working with the California Teachers Association, and also the CFT, California Federation of Teachers, our estimates were last year, there were 26,000 pink slips sent out. 16,000 were ultimately not retained teachers. So about 10,000 were called back. But that last year we had the benefit of the economic stimulus from the federal government, from the president and Congress, of about $2.5 billion, which Assemblymember Bromley and I announced in Long Beach, along with the governor and others, when that money was forthcoming. But this year we're not going to have that. And so this year, our estimates are, as of last night at 5 o'clock, 23,000 pink slips were sent out to hardworking professional educators, teachers in this state. And my fear is, regrettably, a majority will not be retained. And this is on top of those cuts last year, 16,000 cuts to our school districts across the state. And that's on top of about 10,000 classified personnel that have been eliminated, and about 1,000 administrators. I mean, there's a point in your analysis, and one of the questions is, in response to the governor saying we need to cut more in administration, our estimates are about 1,000 administrators have already been reduced. So to me, we've gone as far as we can go. It's inexcusable and an embarrassment for California to not be making the proper investment in the future. California has a long, rich history of really being a breeding ground for innovation, for creativity, for finding solutions to these very complicated, difficult, vexing issues. We've been a trendsetter for other states, even in education. Other states have modeled our world-class content standards. There was a group from Egypt in my office just a few months ago studying our standards, and they were very impressed. In fact, the last thing they said to me is, I said, which standards were you most impressed with? And they said, frankly, all of them, but we're going to extrapolate your career technical education standards, and if you have any career tech teachers that want to live on the Nile, send them over, But now we're seeing, quite frankly, the deterioration of our educational delivery system. 2 months ago, the governor, in front of all of us that are here, I recognize everybody sitting there, during the State of the State address, said that he would fully protect education funding. And I helped lead the applause. I watched the tape, and I think I was the first guy to clap. But as the old saying goes, the devil's in the details. And regrettably, in my opinion, education funding is not being protected. What we have come to find out, and Carol Bingham is our chief budget fiscal analyst for the Department of Education, we have found out that the governor's latest budget proposal, regrettably, is in fact a plan to reduce funding for K through 12 education levels, not just for the prospective year, but also for 08-09 retroactively and 09-10, and impose further new cuts on even this upcoming budget year of 10-11. Besides imposing cuts to Proposition 98 funding, the minimum funding guarantee for K through 14, the governor's budget also puts at risk the federal state fiscal stabilization fund that our office actually wrote the majority of that for when it was announced in Long Beach several months ago. And we've already received about $2.5 billion from that from that grant application that we wrote last year. And we hope to be able to receive about $213 million, about 10% of what we received last time. We were told over and over again by Secretary Duncan and the President's office and the White House, it's one-time money only. It helped us last year, but now it's going to be problematic for those of us counting on it. The issue is questionable calculations related to the state's compliance with the federal MOU, the maintenance of effort, MOE, maintenance of effort requirement, especially the proposal to make a partial prepayment of the 2009-2010 to be able to operate the budget year programs. In addition, the governor is also trying to reopen the 2008-2009 Prop 98 certification that was just enacted by this legislature in July. This action would mean that these outstanding maintenance factor of $11.2 billion, money that's clearly owed to the schools, would no longer exist as a constitutionally required obligation and would be subject to change by both further administrations and by future legislatures. And for the 09-10 budget, the governor is also estimating that the Proposition 98 guarantee will drop by $568 million. The largest single item of which is a $340 million reduction in the K through 3 class size reduction program. We believe that this amount is excessive, that savings will not be fully realized, and the rationale for this we do not understand. And as far as the future looking any brighter, regrettably to the members of this committee, I just can't paint that rosy picture. As the 2010-11 budget calls for the elimination of the current sales tax on both fuel and sales tax on fuel and increasing the excise tax on gasoline. This essentially translates into a $900 million decrease in the minimum funding guarantee baseline funding for the K through 14 funding level. And while total Prop 98 funding is proposed to be relatively flat from year to year, the adjustments in the governor's budget are largely negative because of the need to backfill with one-time money that was used during the last year. The governor's budget proposes to slash $1.2 billion in discretionary funds from school districts in order to try to cap administration costs. And again, our numbers are about 1,000 administrative positions have already been eliminated. And if you look at the ratio of administrators to students, we're already 50th. 50th is the largest number of students per administrator. This really does fly in the face of the flexibility that the legislature and the governor put forth over the last couple of years to give school districts additional flexibility. And we have no evidence that school districts have cut classroom spending while adding to administration or even leaving administrators whole. Finally, we're asking a lot more of our school districts with turning around failing schools and other efforts that are required in the stimulus bill. An additional $202 million in cuts is also proposed in the governor's budget to most programs resulting from a negative cost of living adjustment, which seems unfair given the fact that K through 12 education has not received a cost of living adjustment since the 2007-2008 fiscal year. And while education has experienced, we know, a very slight decrease in enrollment. Yet projections from 2010-11 do show a small increase in student enrollment. However, the governor's budget only proposes funding for 5 programs. Finally, the governor is also calling for a cut of $200 million from child care, which equals to about 18,000 students, child care spots, our youngest students. This I would characterize as a severe cut that will deny children and families vital services that they badly need. This at a time when we already have a waiting list for child care slots of 195,000 students. So that would add almost 20,000 more. The prospects for K-12 public education do look bleak at best. And if this slash and burn policy is allowed to continue, our schools are going to continue to be challenged. Our educators have worked diligently in an attempt to do more with less. But to continue the progress that we have been making, it's going to be much more difficult. These cuts that are being proposed increase the difficulty of our challenge to close the achievement gap, which has been a top priority for many of us, and the legislature and the governor have been very supportive of our efforts. And we need to continue to make sure that all of our students are reaching proficient or advanced. I want to echo your comments, Madam Chair, at the beginning. Very, very difficult challenges. I understand the implosion economically, the national level, state level. All of the options are going to be very difficult. These are unprecedented challenges for all of us, unprecedented times for all of us. But I firmly believe that investing in public education is investing in the future. And if we're going to have strong economic recovery, we're going to need to invest in public education. My last 30 seconds, I'll close with some good news. The good news is that despite these budget challenges, for the last 7 years, really since our assessment instruments have been aligned to our standards, test scores are up incrementally 7 years in a row, almost every subject area, almost every grade level. The achievement gap we've seen for the last 2 years, ever so slight narrowing. But we need to accelerate that narrowing. We're right now on a 30-year trajectory where it'll be extinguished, and that's insufficient. Perhaps the best news is when you look at English language arts. 7 years ago, 35% of our students were proficient or advanced, 35%. The test scores from last year, 50%. It's a similar story for math. 7 years ago, math, we had 35% of our students were advanced or proficient. This year, we're 46%. The good news, we have more students eligible for college. The bad news is we're going to have fewer slots in college, perhaps 40,000 fewer for CSU than we had 2 years ago, and 6,000 fewer for UC. The dropout rate last year actually went down 1%. The graduation rate went up 1%. We have more students taking more rigorous classes, more students enrolled in AP and IB classes in our state. And in the area of career technical education, I think I mentioned something important to the governor, something important to me and members of this legislature. We've never done a press release out of our office on this issue. 7 years ago, we had 300 career tech classes in the state of California that were A through G. We just hit the 7,000 mark. And that really is significant as well for more rigorous coursework. So now's the time to invest in the future. Now is the time to invest in public education.
I really thank you for that, and thank you for reminding me and other members of the board that when we're talking in those terms about how bad off we are right now, we need to close with the good points, the good things that are happening in education. So we need to remind people that there are good things going on in spite of the problems that we're having right now. So thank you so much for those comments.
Thank you.
Ms. Gaither, would you like to? Oh, do you need to leave now? Because I could ask the members
any questions? Yeah, any questions?
Any questions?
And then I think I will.
Right, okay.
Thank you very much. Try to help or suggestions for me.
Mr. Swanson.
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you so much. Superintendent, thank you so much for your comments, and I can agree with many of your sentiments. Like many of my colleagues, I had a chance to visit some of the schools in my district recently, and it's clear that they are trying to get by on fewer and fewer resources, and PTAs and other groups are coming up with more cash to help try to save programs and make education a real priority for our kids. I wanted to ask you if you could comment on two questions. One is we have this debate about education, and we talk about it as if it's a line item in the budget as all other line items to be considered. But we avoid, I think, having a thorough discussion about it as an investment and what kind of returns come back to the state. And so it does, which I think makes it not like every other line item in the budget, but one that has so many positive returns that, in fact, we should do everything we can to fund education. And then the second is how do we address that question of funding? I mean, at this point, there I think has to be a very sober discussion of that question of funding for education, and I don't see how we can get there without agreeing to address head-on this question of funding. So the question of investment and the question of funding.
Two thoughtful questions. Thank you. One is, I don't think I have done enough in terms of linking economic recovery to having that well-skilled, analytical, problem-solving workforce. If you show me a strong economy in any country, really any state, even a region of a state, I'll show you a strong education system. There are other countries that will be able to provide goods more cheaply than California can, because we have higher cost of living here. But what we have to do is make sure we make smarter products, better products, find solutions to problems in the biotech, in the high tech, the nanotech, the green tech that this legislature has been good at working on. And that has to come from our workforce. I mean, I've met with CEOs, and frankly, they don't complain to me on taxes, on workers' comp, on infrastructure needs that we have, on environmental regulations. It's the fact that for them to be able to attract good workers, they have to use visas, work with the immigration system to get engineers in from other countries to work in the Silicon Valley. And so these are the folks, even some of the folks running for U.S. Senate I've met in the past when she was wearing a other hat for a major company. And the whole talk was on education and give me quality education. So, I mean, that's, there are emerging developing third world countries that wish to remain so no longer. We're dropping economically, California. I mean, 6 years ago, we were the 5th largest economy in the world. Today, we're 8th. And I would suggest it's in part to not investing in public education. And then the resources part, my pitch here today, and my role is different than it used to be and different from yours. I'm the advocate for education. And I don't want to suggest that we shortchange pregnant mothers, starving kids, don't release prisoners. I'm going to give you that. But my role is to be the advocate for the schools. That's where your jobs are really, really tough. And I get that, and the education committee gets that. But what we have to do is be smart and make education a priority, help us grow this economy. And then what I would want to suggest is give local school districts the tools to help generate some of that money. That's the revenue side. I spearhead the effort, worked 13 years here to reduce the vote threshold from the 2/3 to 55%. And candidly, in 28 years hanging around this place, that's what I'm most proud of, is my work in that area. Governor Wilson was very helpful. And what we need to do is take that same type of approach for parcel taxes. It's contained in SCA 6. I think there might be a measure on the ballot. It's in circulation. And then have people try to determine how else can we provide local communities the ability to generate dough locally.
Yeah, I think that many of the school districts throughout the state have gone to parcel tax solutions, and many of them have passed. And I think that giving them the tools to be able to pass these measures to fund, if we're not willing to make the tough decisions about raising additional revenue, then the local governments have to have that. And that's why I would agree with that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Swanson, may I follow up on your question? You mentioned in your response about corporations asking you for a well-trained workforce.
Correct.
Are they also willing to contribute to that effort?
Very definitely. I find they realize it's in their best interest. And so, categorically, yes.
That's what I found, too. And the other thing that I always ask them, in what area are you saying that we are, that we need improvement? Because a lot of times, people say, we need to just improve our education. Well, we need to know exactly how they mean, because everybody is working as hard as they possibly can. And so I always ask that follow-up question, in what area are you suggesting that we improve, and how can you help us do that?
It's partnerships that happen.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I'm sorry, Ms. Brownlee, and you weren't here earlier, but I was thanking you so much for stepping in while I was gone, so thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you're back. Thank you, Mr. O'Connell, and thank you really for your leadership over the last 8 years around education. We really do appreciate it. And you had mentioned in your comments about you have a breakout of the $17 billion that aren't going to schools. I'd really like to see that. I know that when we start to gather the maintenance factor at $11+ billion, the deficit factor, which is growing in the billions of dollars, the amount of money that we have not given to schools relative to mandates, you just start collecting those pots of money, and you see large amounts of money that schools aren't receiving. And I think the way you characterize some of the enormous challenges that our schools are facing. As chair of the Education Committee, I have many people coming through my office every single day, and even yesterday actually had a group of administrators in my office who were talking about the pink slips that were happening at their schools. And I think many people think that the pink slips that are happening are for our newest teachers, perhaps even some of the teachers that are tenured. But indeed, these are pink slips going out to teachers who were hired in their districts in 2002 and 2003. These are the teachers, our most experienced teachers, who are getting pink slips from their districts right now. And I thought that was pretty compelling to understand, who those teachers are that are getting the pink slips. And I think there's no question in the world that every adult that is at our school sites are working really, really hard, and they really care about what they're doing. But this investment that you're speaking of is so critically important to invest to create the right infrastructure and the right conditions for good teaching and learning. I mean, you're only able, an English teacher, how is an English teacher able to really teach in a class of 40 or 50 people and grade papers and have them go through? How is that possible? I mean, and so we're asking them to do things and to improve student learning in the worst conditions possible. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to make a greater investment. We need to, I think as a state, we need to begin to lay out a plan about how we're going to make that investment. I think Mr. Swanson's point is a very good one, that we are going to spend a great deal of time drilling down in this committee about where we can make reasonable cuts, but we're not going to spend any time at all talking about what an investment would do relative to our education system and relative to California's future economically. And so I think that we need to spend more time in that area. And I guess I would just really close by asking you, if from your vantage point, do you have any suggestions to us? We're desperate. We don't want to make another cut to schools, not another penny more. And I guess, if you have any suggestions or recommendations that you can make to this committee, not necessarily right now in this moment, but as we wrestle, as we wrestle through this, and it's you and your department that really understand a lot of what is going on. You have a lot of data. If there are data and other recommendations that you can share with us, we would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments, Mr. Berry?
Yeah, Secretary O'Connell, really do appreciate the work you've done over the years advocating for schools, and I think all of us appreciate our public education system and want it to be the best in the world. Clearly, through these economic times, education has struggled, and you're absolutely right. They have cut to the bone, and it's tough, and they don't know where to turn to now. In following up on Assemblymember Brownlee, I would love to see some recommendations. We have to look at more efficient ways of doing things. Some of the things that I've talked to some of my educators in my district the idea of maybe, I mean, we test more than the national average. Maybe we need to back off and get closer to the national average. That would save some money and time. Textbook adoption, maybe we can push that back a little bit. We do have standards if things change that much. I would love to see a list of ideas and thoughts that we might be able to save a little money here and there to try to, as well as flexibility with some of the programs. I'm curious, as a freshman legislator, in the process, do you collaborate with the governor's office for his proposals, or no?
Yes, and the best example would be, and we weren't successful, so it may not be the best, was on the race to the top.
Yeah.
And that was unprecedented collaboration. Our office, you're going to hear from the Secretary's office, I think, in a minute or two. Oh. And that's the way it should be.
Right.
And there are times when we just respectfully agree to disagree.
Sure.
But the short answer is yes.
Yeah, good.
It's a good two-way street.
Yeah, but those recommendations, you're in the trenches every day out there. You see it face to face more so than we do, and so I think you would have a better grasp on where those areas that we can make our system. And you try to make a positive out of just a lousy situation, and maybe we come out of this thing. When we do come out of it, we come out as a more efficient, better run system. So that would be my only suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yeah, Mr.
I guess we all need to get a word in edgewise here. It's a little early in the year to start doing the tributes to the many, many years in the Senate and in the role of superintendent, but I just wanted to add my comments to the others in terms of thanking you for your leadership. And you were talking about the difference in role relative to being superintendent as an advocate. And I know you worked hard to balance out all the challenges, but you were a tremendous advocate for education in the state Senate as well. So, and the Assembly before that. So, anyway, we do appreciate all of your work. My only comment, because I think it's all been said very eloquently, is I think we have found with regards to taxes and fees that not only does the public support education when given the opportunity, if you have a relatively democratic process that doesn't allow a tiny minority to decide for the majority, but also if they can see what the money's going to be spent for. And that, we tend to see better results at the local level on taxes than we do statewide because people trust that they have a local process and it's more transparent and they can see the schools and see the kids and see the results. And so I really wanted to concur with your direction in terms of us trying to help local school districts where they can find ways to raise revenue.
Yeah.
So,
in fact, if you want some of the numbers, not this past November, but 16, 17 months ago, during the bottom of the recession, 91% of the school bonds in the state of California passed. Mm-hmm. And it's not just 9 out of 10. It was 77 out of 85. Mm-hmm. 81% partial tax measures passed, and that's even with a higher vote threshold. And 90% of the Mello-Roos districts passed. So even during the recession, people...
Absolutely proves my point.
It does.
Yeah. But for those districts who are, perhaps have a little tougher time getting it, having a more democratic process with a more reasonable threshold, even if it remains a supermajority like we have for the school bonds, a more achievable supermajority.
Oakland came up with 63%, needed 67 partial tax last year.
Mr. Swanson.
And let me just say that there couldn't be a more active period in history where parents and teachers and community leaders are going over school budgets with a fine-tooth comb. They're already doing that. I mean, they've experienced $17 billion in cuts. If anyone thinks that where there has been an opportunity for them to save, they have done that. Right. At this point, they're up against a wall. Yeah. And we are now cutting into the quality of education that we can provide our children. And so I hope we don't spend too much time trying to find that dollar that we think still can be saved, as if that's not going on every day in the life of a school district. And so we are just up against it, and we have to admit that and find the money if we want education to be a priority.
Your typical school district, 90% of their money goes to salaries and benefits. Make your point.
And you also mentioned about the arts and music being cut, sports programs being cut. I mean, I would argue that before we even started to make these cuts, over the last couple of years to schools. Schools who have music programs and who have a full cadre of arts programs, who have lots of offerings regarding sports programs. They were already fundraising to support those programs. We were contributing very little to those programs in the first place. So to even, say that these cuts are impacting those programs, we impacted those programs many, many, many years ago. It was just through the hard work of communities to raise those monies to maintain those programs, and now we've just broken them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much for
Thank you very
coming
much.
in.
Thanks, everybody.
We're always glad to see you.
Jill. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gaither?
Thank you, kids. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome to our committee.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you to all of you for inviting me here today. Secretary Reese really wanted to be here, but she had business in Los Angeles today and so was unable to be here. On behalf of the Secretary, she wanted me to say that we really look forward to working with all of you as the budget progresses. Education is the top priority of the governor. We just had a meeting last week with all of the education leaders, including Superintendent O'Connell, and the group pledged to work jointly to protect education funding in the budget. We know that education is the way to ensure economic growth in California, and it is the most certain way that we can bring ourselves out of our current economic climate. We know that the students today need to be educated so that they can participate in that economic growth tomorrow. For that reason, the governor remains committed to protecting education, and there may be disagreements over the details of how he protected education, but it is true that funding is level for K-12 from year to year. Funding for higher ed was increased from year to year. There is no other area of the budget that escaped reductions year over year. So these aren't cuts that he wanted to make. These aren't steps that he wanted to take. But the fact remains that we have a $20 billion deficit on top of the $60 billion that we faced over the past year. And there simply isn't enough money in the budget to fund everything at the level that it really needs to be funded. So we know that education could use more funding. The governor would like to give education more funding if he could, but it's just not there. We know that the choices before you are difficult. The choices you will have to make over the coming months are challenging. And I think we understand how challenging those choices are, having just gone through proposing a budget. So we would simply ask that you protect education funding, and I think that's the governor's commitment. We also want to thank you for working jointly with us on education reforms and helping us to compete for Race to the Top. We know that we were not successful in the first round, but we also know that we got some good changes. The growth assessment model will help us in the future to do exactly what the superintendent talked about and what many have talked about in terms of knowing where we can do better, which students are progressing even below the proficiency bar. And you've heard that President Obama and Secretary Duncan are actually proposing using growth assessment as their measure for ESEA rather than the summative assessment. So we know that that step that you took last year was forward thinking and helped move us ahead of the game for ESEA reauthorization. And we also think that it will be better for our students, better for our teachers, and better for measurement of how well our students are progressing so that we can increase our achievement overall. While we were not successful in the first round of Race to the Top application, we do intend to submit a stronger application as soon as we find out why we were not successful, which will not be until April. Along with every other state that wasn't a finalist, we're anxiously waiting those comments and scores from the federal government. When we met with superintendents over the state last year while we were working on Race to the Top, and I'm certain you heard this in your hearings that you held, one of the things that we heard over and over again was the call for more flexibility. And we have provided, as a state, with your help, we have provided some funding flexibility. But what we heard from those superintendents is a need for staffing flexibility, the need to be able to control how they assign, reassign teachers, or in times like these, where unfortunately we may face layoffs, we want to help protect our most vulnerable and poorest schools. We think that those schools should not bear the brunt of teacher layoffs, reassignments, and staffing shifts. So the governor has proposed staffing flexibility as part of his budget. We also think that this is an essential component of turnarounds. So it also fits in with the goals of ESEA, the goals of the federal government in terms of ensuring that highly effective teachers are distributed equitably and that our lowest performing schools, our most vulnerable students, are not put at even further risk by having teachers that change every year. The governor has pursued every possible funding source. We were the first state in the nation to be approved for the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. The first tranche of those funds were distributed and helped avoid layoffs. We still have $1.8 billion of that money that has not been drawn down. Schools are still, in some cases, holding on to the funds from last year, and so until those funds are drawn down, the federal government is reluctant to allow us to draw down that extra $1.8 billion. Additionally, we have $490 million that we will be eligible for as soon as our round 2 application is approved for State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. I know that there's been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of assertions about our MOE application, but I think it's important to note that every indication we have from the U.S. Department of Education is that our MOE is acceptable to them. We have responded to their letter of last week. They sent the letter actually in order to have our response in writing, so that the comments, which are in writing, can also be side by side with our response. So we are not concerned at all that we will not be approved, and so we think that that $490 million will shortly be available. We will continue to pursue Race to the Top, any other federal grants that come along. We wish that there were more funding available, but we're at least trying to get every other dollar that we can. And we hope to work collaboratively with you, with the field, with the superintendent. And in the theme of ending on a good note, I would like to just remind all of us in the audience as well as here that there are good things happening in school districts, community colleges, CSUs, and UCs. Last week, I went down to a regional event for a CTE program that is a joint program operated between the K-12 high schools, community colleges, and the CSUs in the Inland Empire. And it was really an amazing program, the way that they have articulated all of their courses so that students, while they're in high school, are earning college credit, and all of the new programs are partnered with local industries. They've received donations of land and equipment for the community college district, and the partnerships that they've created have enabled those students to walk out of those programs straight into local jobs. So they are helping their local economy, and they're doing all of this despite the fiscal challenges that they have been facing, along with every other school district and community college in the state. So we know that there are innovative and creative school leaders out there, and we know that we need to do the very best we can to help them continue to be innovative and creative. Our students deserve no less from all of us, and we pledge to work together with you to help keep education funding a priority. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your perspective. Members, you have Mr. Swanson and then Ms. Brownlee.
Yes. Thank you so much for your testimony. You were here when the superintendent offered his testimony.
Yes.
And he offered as one solution to additional revenue. And in your statement, you said the governor would like to spend more on schools if he had more to spend on schools. What about the support of the initiative to lower the threshold for being able to pass these partial tax initiatives so that local communities could have the tools to raise revenues locally where the state fails. Does the Office of Secretary have any opinion about that, or does the governor have an opinion that you can share with us on that? Or
Superintendent O'Connell raised that in the meeting last week with the governor, and I think it's something the governor's still looking at. We don't have a position yet, but every idea is an idea that needs to be considered and looked at.
so you think it's fair to say the governor doesn't rule out signing such a bill to move that issue forward?
I think he hasn't taken a position either way, so it's neither ruled out nor ruled in.
The governor, in his state address, talked about prison budget and the budget. He wanted to make sure that we spent more on schools than we did on prisons. You do remember that statement then?
Yes.
The governor. And so would the Office of Secretary of Education or the governor's office, are you interested in spending more on education in prisons to help lower the recidivism rates so that we can save some of that money and transfer it to schools?
I only work with the education area. I really have no knowledge at all about the corrections. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right.
Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Gaither, for being here. And I think by virtue of you being here, hopefully demonstrates the desire that you've stated in terms of working collaboratively. But as tradition goes in these hearings, when you come at the beginning of a hearing and then we don't see you anymore, and I understand that, and that's okay. But I guess I did have a couple of questions to ask you, since it might be the only time that we have the opportunity to ask. And one, you talked about collaboration and a meeting that you've had with just recently that the governor's office had with education leaders. And can you describe who those education leaders were that you met with? Or
It was the heads of all of the higher ed segments, as well as Superintendent O'Connell, as well as student association presidents.
I see. Okay. But not others in the advocates in the educational arena in Sacramento, the California School Board Association, or the administrators or teachers. Okay. You also mentioned, and I agree that, and I hear it as well, is that you hear so much about, particularly from administrators, the need for flexibility of funding at schools and needing that. But it seems to me that the governor's proposal, the bulk of the reductions that are made in education have to do with revenue limit, which is flexible money, and very less to do with areas where, categoricals and others where there is less flexibility. So I'm trying to understand the difference between what you've stated as a priority and what the actual proposal is.
I think often it's just a function of mathematics. The revenue limit is the largest portion of the education budget, just as education is the largest portion of the state budget. So it just appears to be the places that have to take the reductions. It's just simple math. I don't think it's a reflection of his lack of commitment to flexibility. I think that he's very committed to flexibility, and it's something that superintendents and many of the associations that you mentioned have said were important to them in being able to balance their budgets. I would like to note that the Secretary is interested in meeting with the associations and will be scheduling meetings with them. They've requested time with her, and we're absolutely committed to meeting with as many people as possible. And I think the meeting with the governor and the leaders was unprecedented in having all four of those leaders together. I can't recall. I've worked for 4 governors, and I don't think it's happened very often. So it was a very good meeting between them all, and I think that they all emerged from that meeting feeling very committed to jointly working to protect education funding across the board.
Well, and I think, it sounds to me like it was a very good first step. I guess, from my vantage point, I think that in order for us to really wrestle with these critical issues around education, that we have to be more expansive in sort of our inclusiveness.
Absolutely.
And that I think everybody really needs to be at the table. At the end of the day, are we all going to agree? Probably not. But I think that we all need to be at the table trying to come up with creative solutions to be as helpful in the process and really to yield what I believe would probably be the best outcome if we have all the ideas on the table from everyone. And I guess just my last question, I think, while you're here, and I appreciate it that you are, is really around the maintenance factor. I think, as we start these meetings, this is going to be an issue that's going to kind of permeate all of the discussions. And since you're here and representing the governor, I was just wondering if you might be able to comment on the proposal around the maintenance factor. And I guess this is the question that I want to ask is, does the governor, in his proposal, does he believe that the maintenance factor doesn't apply and therefore is not acknowledging the maintenance factor in this budget proposal? Or is it that he does believe that the statutory agreement that we made was an honorable agreement and is just proposing not to recognize the maintenance factor at this moment in time?
I'm going to let my colleague from the Department of Finance address this question. Thank you.
Sure. Nicholas Schweitz with Department of Finance. So as we discussed, I think maybe a few weeks ago on the maintenance factor.
I think we can. If you're going to answer the question, then we can raise this question at another time because you'll be here to
Sure.
answer that question. I was just asking because the secretary is here, and if you had any comments relative to it.
I don't have any comments other than the normal budgetary comments. Again, I think that the governor really did the best he could to provide as much money as he could to education, and he himself would probably stipulate that we could use more. And I think we'll just have to try to protect what we have proposed in the budget and keep education moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Swanson, you had another comment.
Yeah, and I know how tough it is to come and have to answer some of these questions, but it's frustrating that some of us cannot accept the only answer being cuts. And so that's why there's this pushing on what we're actually going to do. And so it'd be real helpful for us if your office and the governor would send some kind of communication. I mean, if we're willing to at least give the voters of California a choice to prioritize education by us putting a revenue choice on the ballot and the governor saying, I'll support that. Even if your position is you don't want to raise revenue, at least we ought to give the people of California a chance to consider raising revenue so they have a choice. And we can do that if we agree to give them that choice. And that's why I think that it's an important question as we go forward, because you're asking school districts to cut. We're cutting child care, so parents that want to work or make a decision between working or providing child care, and so our state is just moving backwards. And so I think that it's important to know that we need some proactive decision-making around giving the people of California a choice around whether they want to raise more revenue for what they feel is a priority, which is schools. So I hope you can just take that back. You guys can talk about it in these meetings you're having, and the governor can send us some signal that, I'll give the people of California at least the opportunity to vote up or down whether we're going to spend more money for our schools. And I'd just like to receive some kind of signal about that question. Because if the position is if we had more money, we'd do it. Okay, then there's another part of that question. That is, if the people have a choice or given a choice, and they can be given a choice quickly by us passing the ability to put something on the ballot for them to make a choice, then that seems to be a fair approach to this question. And we'll let the chips fall where they may. People can vote up or down whether they want to spend more for schools. I think they would spend more for schools, as they've done it in communities throughout the state. But I think if we do it as a statewide initiative, it'll be more organized, and I think we'll get better results.
I'm happy to take that message back. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Yes, Mr. Berryhill.
Yeah, to go back to the collaboration in making recommendations, and a little bit of what my colleague, Assemblymember Brownlee, was touching on. I think it is important for the leadership from the governor's office to the education secretary to also meet with all those that have skin in the game. And I think there needs to be a collaboration and a development of ideas and recommendations to this legislature, and it should be done with a broader group of those leaders with all the various organizations that have skin in the game in education. And I think if done right, you can develop a real synergy of working together that will benefit education going forward for years to come. But we really all do. I mean, we're all in this boat together, and we've got to collaborate and work with as many of those that are in the game. Thanks.
Thank you.
And
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Chair, Ms. Gaither used the unfortunate phrase, the normal budgetary answer, which I think is code for no answer. And I just want to express both frustration, and is not unique to this moment, but in all virtually all budget hearings, with the lack of forthcomingness. Our leader, the new speaker, has expressed a desire to strengthen the subcommittee process and get away from the end game Big Five decision making. And I just want to say that if we're going to, and I support that very strongly, but if we're going to be successful at it, we need to start having really meaningful dialogues early in the process where we can get the kinds of specific answers and not just have, especially when we're successful getting a fairly high representative of the department, which I appreciate, and I assume the other members do. It's very important that we start strengthening the subcommittee process. And again, this is a general comment. I'm not just, you use that phrase so you open the door for me. But it's a reflection of what generally happens in subcommittee, which is very difficult to get the kind of really meaty details and dialogue that it takes to get started on building a budget. And so I hope that we can begin to move towards the brave promise of our speaker to try to get back to the way things used to work in this process, which is much more transparent, much more public, and builds a kind of collaboration, I think, by respectfully early on having the detailed conversations that we need to get moving on solving these difficult problems.
Well, I really appreciate you coming down and speaking with us. And as you can hear from all the members, they all appreciate it as well. And so I want to encourage you, if you go back to your office and you can think of anything else that would help us with our deliberations, if you could just contact me, I would make sure that all the members of the committee is informed of any information that you can furnish us, because we are really up against a very hard situation. So anything that your office can do to help us, we would really appreciate it. So again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I know that the secretary would want me to say that she does want to work with you collaboratively, and I will take all of this back to her and to the governor's office, and we will try to talk to you as much as we can. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer your question. It simply is that I don't work on the budget anymore, and so I don't have those technical details at hand. Were I to have known you would ask the question, I would have been briefed better, and I apologize.
So now that you know us, as I said, anything that you can do to help, any information that you have from your office, make sure that we get it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We're going to begin now with our discussion, and issue number one is background on Proposition 98 again and again and again, but we're going to go there. And we're going to begin with our LAO representative presentation from Edgar. What's your last name? His last? Cabral. So if you could begin for us, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Good morning. Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. And I believe there's a handout being passed out to you that will be the basis of my presentation. The idea for the overview is just to provide you some brief background on the governor's budget, both on the Proposition 98 funding formula, then also some of the specifics about the spending plan, on what the governor's proposing to spend and what to cut. And we will provide some general recommendations. The idea is to be high level, to give you sort of a framework of our recommendations, and then we'll kind of go into the specific details of all these recommendations as we hear all the items individually, both today and then at future hearings. So I'd like to start on page 1, just talking about the Proposition 98 formula and the issues regarding the maintenance factor. I know that it's been mentioned before, and it really has resulted in some big uncertainties and differences of opinion about how much funding is required under the rules of Proposition 98. So there was this uncertainty about, in the 2008-9 year, what the maintenance factor obligation was that we created. And this obligation then creates a future requirement to restore funding to schools in future years. There was a July agreement as part of the July budget that created an additional $9.9 billion in maintenance factor. That was in addition to $1.3 billion that already existed. So a total of $11.2 billion in maintenance factor obligation at the end of the 8-9 year. The governor in the new proposal, the governor's budget backs away from that deal and does things a little bit differently. The governor goes back and says, actually, the administration does not believe a maintenance factor obligation has been created. And as a result, there is not this significant obligation moving forward. In addition, in the 2008-9 year, the governor says that the minimum guarantee was lower than we thought, and we provided significantly more than was required. That amount, that sort of excess funding, is used to then pay off the existing $1.3 billion obligation that we had from prior years. So moving forward, the governor's proposal has no maintenance factor obligation, whereas if you followed the rules of the July agreement, then there would be an $11.2 billion obligation. So there's big differences in the obligation carried moving forward. Now, if there's any questions, I'll move on to any questions on that?
Go ahead.
Okay, so on the next page, on page 2, we show you what's the fiscal effect of these differences. So if you look at the chart on page 2, the black bars are the governor's budget funding proposals at their estimate of the Prop 98 minimum guarantee. Then if you look in the gray bars these are our estimates of what you would have had to provide to meet the minimum guarantee if you were following the rules of the July agreement. So as you can see, there's a very significant difference. It's more than $2 billion different in 9-10 and more than $3 billion different in 2010-11. And this is primarily due to this maintenance factor obligation that's carried forward that requires additional payments in 9-10 and in 10-11, and it creates these big disparities. Now, the governor does propose paying off some of this obligation, but he doesn't propose to start paying this until 2011-12. Not really a maintenance factor obligation. They're saying it's a sort of statutory commitment to provide funding in future years. So on the next page, we talk about a little bit about our assessment of the plan. We do think that it's tenuously held together, both because it's based on these specific assumptions regarding the maintenance factor that are different from what was in the July agreement, and also because the minimum guarantee could change significantly if revenues were to change moving forward as we update our numbers for these years. If you did want to take a different approach, if you didn't want to follow the governor's budget, you really have two options. First, you could decide that you wanted to fund current law, that you wanted to recognize this $11 billion obligation, and that you wanted to carve out resources in your budget to provide that money. That would require an additional $3 billion in the 2010-11 years, so that would require $3 billion in cuts in other areas of the budget to fund. You could also raise revenues if you didn't want to cut other areas of the budget, you could raise revenues. But the problem with that is that you raise revenues and you also raise your minimum guarantee. So really, to sort of close that gap, you'd have to raise about $6 billion in new revenue and give all of it to education to meet the obligations under the current law interpretation where you do owe, where you recognize the maintenance factor obligation. The other approach is just to suspend Proposition 98, and a suspension requires a 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature. But what this does is it allows you to spend whatever amount you would like. So you don't have to worry about, whether you don't have to worry about these uncertainties in the formula about revenues, about whether we owe this maintenance factor or not. You could choose to spend whatever level you think you could afford. By suspending, you actually create a maintenance factor obligation in the future, and so funding would be restored in future years, but you don't have to be too concerned about whether you're meeting the specific requirements of Prop 98 or the specific funding level in this particular year. So it provides you the most flexibility.
And we've done that how many times?
We've done that once before in the 2004-05 fiscal year.
A recommendation from the LAO?
Well, right now we're just trying to lay out all of the options that are available to you. We do think that it probably provides the most flexibility of all, because you can sort of have a discussion specifically about how much you could afford and don't have to worry about these moving pieces. So we do think it's the most flexible. We didn't sort of lay out what a specific recommendation we had. We just thought we'd provide you with all the options.
We're going to be discussing recommendations in later hearings.
So then, are there any questions specifically with the formula, Prop 98 formula stuff? So then moving on to the next page, I'll start talking about the specific proposals in the governor's budget regarding not on the Prop 98 formula, but just on the proposals to how to spend the money. The governor proposes some reductions that are primarily from revenue limits, and we're going to talk about these in detail later, so I won't spend too much time on them, but there are $1.7 billion in reductions to K-12 revenue limits, which are the most flexible general purpose funds available to schools. $1.2 billion of that is related to a proposal to reduce school district non-instructional spending. Another $300 million is linked with a proposal that would ease restrictions for contracting out of non-instructional services. And then there's a $200 million reduction that's associated with applying a negative cost of living adjustment. There's also another proposal on revenue limits for county offices to make a reduction and require some consolidation of services. And then finally, there's a proposal for making reductions to K-3 class size reduction based on estimates of decline in the use of the program because of these additional penalties that were adopted. And we'll go through these later in more detail later on. So moving on our next page on our handout, we provide you with some framework for our recommendations. We do think that the governor's plan is headed in the right direction, but we think that there are some areas where more solutions could be provided. The governor's office does certainly provide a variety of proposals for making reductions to revenue limits, but we do think there are other things you should consider in building your spending plan for 2010-11. In particular, we think you should look at additional ways to maximize flexibility, given that we are requiring additional reductions to schools, and we know that schools will be running out of some of the federal funding that was available to them in prior years. We want to provide them with as much flexibility as possible to spend the money they do have in ways that they think are best for their students. We also think that this is a good time to consider comprehensive mandate reform. We did publish a report specifically on mandates, I believe last month, where we go through every single mandate and provide some recommendations on eliminating some of these mandates or funding them, but trying to go through and decide which of these are important and which we should eliminate to provide some more flexibility for schools. We also have some recommendations on aligning program efforts. Sometimes there are some federal programs that we could better align. Other times it's a variety of state programs or state-local programs. So we have some recommendations related to that. And then finally, we think you should continue to seek additional federal funding. And we'll discuss these in later hearings. And we do have some additional information for you on the last 3 pages of our handout that I won't go into detail, but that provides some of the details regarding some of the recommendations.
Okay. Department of Finance, do you have any additional comments?
Nicholas Schweitz with Department of Finance. Since we're going to discuss, well, we've discussed a lot of and I've given the administration's position on the Proposition 98. I won't go into much detail, just to say that, we believe that we have fully funded the guarantee and maintained Proposition 98 funding flat over the from the prior year over the next 2 years. And then the other proposals in the budget are on the agenda, and we'll go into them in more detail. So I'll wait till then, and just willing to answer any questions anyone has right now.
Members, questions?
Well, I'll go back and ask my question that I originally asked, and around with regards to the maintenance factor. So you're saying you're fully funding Prop 98, you're standing by that, but relative to what the statutory agreement was last year, there is no maintenance factor built into what you have proposed. Right.
This goes back to a sort of a debate that folks have been having regarding Test 1 and whether maintenance factor is created under Test 1.
No, I know the debate. I know the debate. I'm just trying to get to the the statutory agreement that was made.
Right, and the statute at the time the legislation was adopted, we were in a Test 3, and we did believe that maintenance factor was being created. However, since that time, and we did not anticipate this, we believed that Test 3 would be what.
So the governor's changed his mind. Is that what you're saying? I mean, we made an agreement, but now he's, saying, based on I have more information now, and I don't agree with what I agreed to.
Well, let me quibble a little bit with that assessment. I can't say that. Certainly the governor or the administration never agreed that under a Test 1 that maintenance factor would be created. And since we are now under a Test 1, we are sticking to that belief. Although the statutory language says that there is a maintenance factor, there is also language in the statute that lays out a payment plan for the $11 billion in case it is found that there's not a maintenance factor created in that year. And so we're interpreting that language to basically continue to require that $11 billion be repaid to schools based on the statutory language rather than the Constitution, which does not require it be paid to schools. So we believe there is a statutory requirement to pay maintenance factor, but we don't believe there's a constitutional requirement to pay maintenance factor that creates maintenance factor for that year.
So in the trailer bill language, which I don't have in front of me on this agreement, you're saying that there was not anything in the agreement in terms of when a maintenance factor, when it would be triggered in terms of beginning to pay that back.
That we
no
are
obligation for.
Right, we are proposing to change the date when the repayment begins. Currently in statute, it is to begin in 10/11. We're proposing to push that back to 11/12.
Okay, so the agreement was for 10/11, and you're planning on pushing that back, so that you're planning on having another negotiation with the legislature and the governor's office on this issue.
Right. Yes, the administration's proposing trailer bill language to amend that date.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Thank you so much. We're just going to move on to issue 2, the governor's budget proposal regarding the class size reduction. And if we could have you, Nick, to comment on that, or are we going to have another person to do this? Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thomas Todd, Finance. As your agenda indicates, the governor's budget scores prospective savings for the K-3 CSR program of $340 million in the current year and $550 million for the budget year. To be very candid with all of you, I think we would note that this is not an overly precise estimate. This is a rough estimate of savings. It's based fundamentally, though, on the core assumption that districts are going to, the vast majority of districts participating in this program will move from 20 to 1 up to 25 to 1 or greater. There are, at least two circumstances that we think are going to create this movement. Obviously, local budget circumstances. Districts are dealing with constrained budgets. But just as importantly, there was a significant revision to the penalty schedule for this program that was enacted last year in trailer bill legislation, such that a district participating in this program can now actually retain 70% of their incentive funding, irrespective of the class size. To further emphasize that, a current participant in this program could go to 22 to 1 and retain about 90% of their incentive grant. Under the old penalty schedule for this program that was in place as late as the 2007-8 fiscal year, that very same participant would not have received any funding from this program whatsoever.
So they retain 90%?
They retain 90%, that's correct, under the revised penalty schedule that was implemented last year. So, fundamentally, these two trends point to what we think is going to be significant savings in this program. We would also note that, we talk to folks that work with local districts in developing their budgets, and universally, they all indicated to us that districts are increasing class sizes. They also indicated, again, this is anecdotal evidence, but they did indicate that, there are many districts out there that are considering eliminating their participation in one or more grades within this program. And there are some that are, considering wholesale elimination from participation in the program. And, anecdotal evidence actually suggests that, that is occurring to some extent.
So if they stop participating, they would still retain 90%?
No. If they did not participate, no. If they did not participate, if they did not submit an application to participate in this program, no, they would not receive funding. So, while we admit that the estimate is rough, we think it's a credible one, based on the trends, based on the revised penalty schedule that's out there. That said, we're also willing to look at this estimate, and re-examine this estimate to the extent that we can get some updated information, any kind of credible information that the Department of Ed can provide us. We're certainly willing to take a look at that. Based on preliminary indications from the department, it doesn't sound like that information is going to be forthcoming until probably May or June. I think what we would try to underscore or emphasize here is, to the extent they can share anything, even if it's preliminary, it's something that we'd certainly be willing to take a look at.
Thank you. Questions?
If you were going to abandon if school districts were going to abandon the program altogether, as you said, may happen anecdotally, some of the information that you have. But let's just say hypothetically that every single district in the state of California abandoned class size reduction altogether. What's the savings, the scored savings to the state?
So when you say abandon, are you saying that they would not, they would not actually participate, or they wouldn't submit an application?
They would not participate.
At all?
Because they just couldn't afford to.
The savings would be the balance of the program in terms of what's actually provided.
And I'm asking you just what the dollar amount is on that.
The dollar amount budgeted for the program in budget year, well, taking into consideration that we defer about $570 million into the first week of the next fiscal year, the base appropriation amount that you'll actually find in the Budget Act, or the proposed budget bill, is about $693 million.
Okay.
And then another $500 million for the first week of the next fiscal year?
It's about $1.2 billion altogether.
Combined, right, exactly.
Okay. LAO's office?
Yeah,
or
thank
do
you.
Have another comment?
Rachel Ehlers, LAO, yeah. I think just on this issue, we don't really understand why anybody would choose to not participate in the program at all anymore, because they can raise class sizes all the way to the maximum allowed by law and still get 70% of the funding under the new penalty schedule. So in terms of a savings estimate, if you wanted to be the most aggressive possible and say every school was going to increase their kindergarten through third grade class size up to the 30 kids or 31 kids allowed by law, the program would still get 70% of the funding. So why anybody would walk away from all of that, I don't think we understand. So
actually, just to clarify, we're not actually suggesting that would be the case.
Right. I just don't know why anybody would. But right. Gotcha. So there's two issues before you here. There's the current year, 2009-10. What are schools really doing? If they're increasing class sizes, there will be savings that will come back on the natural. And what should we estimate those will be? The governor's office has estimated around $340 million. Based on what we're seeing, we think that's a little bit optimistic, and we think that the savings would actually be a little bit less. But again, we're waiting for real data. We would recommend thinking about $200 million as a more reasonable estimate. But then looking ahead to the budget year 2010-11, the governor's proposal is to stick with the current program and just assume that more and more schools are going to increase their class sizes and therefore more savings are going to come back to the state. We have an alternative proposal for you to consider, which is really saying that this program is no longer meeting its original goals because districts can no longer afford to have classrooms of 20 kids. Just the fiscal realities, that's where it is. So to then be taking money back from them, making them have to make these impossible choices of increasing class sizes and therefore losing additional funds doesn't seem to make sense to us. We would suggest that an alternative approach would be to put this program into the flex item, as we've been calling it, allow districts to keep the funds and make the decisions at the local level based on their priorities, whether they need to increase class sizes, how much they need to increase class sizes, whether they need to shorten the school year, whether they need to change their teacher contracts, whatever their decisions are at the local level in order to get through these fiscal times without penalties associated with them. So specifically, our approach would be put the program into the flex item based on 2007-8 participation levels before most of the big budget cuts came through to avoid hitting certain districts that have had to make difficult decisions in recent years, and then just cut the whole program by 20%, which is exactly what has happened with all of the other 40 programs in the categorical flex item. Be a different approach, offer districts more flexibility, acknowledge that the program's no longer meeting its original goals, and then in the future, when the state's finances improve, if the legislature wants to reestablish a class size reduction program, then reestablish it then, but trying to pretend that it still exists as it was originally intended right now while putting these penalties on districts seems to not make sense.
Well, how much of the money would be left in the budget, 70%, or is it the total amount?
Under our proposal, and in 10-11, it would be 80% of the original program. So the savings would be about $380 million as compared to $550 million is assumed by the governor. So a lesser amount of savings. But again, I think we're questioning whether the savings the governor's office is anticipating would even materialize.
Madam Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out this money. Okay, go ahead.
All right. I support keeping the item open. I'm authoring a cleanup bill, AB 548, to last year's education budget trailer bill to address the problems that have arisen for districts claiming class size reduction funding under the prior budget flexibility proposal. And this bill is an urgency measure and is awaiting a hearing at Senate Education Committee. So hopefully it will help to bring some clarity. As we've heard, many districts submitted their J7 forms with the understanding that they would be able to revise their class size reduction figures prior to the April deadline, and unfortunately the passage of the trailer bill froze the allocations based on that data, the J7 data, and this has resulted in many districts not receiving the entire allocation for which they're entitled, class size reduction allocation. So until this problem is resolved and districts are provided the full allocations they're entitled to, the Department of Education will not be able to provide us with the true savings amount, if any. So it just makes sense that we hold the item open until the issue is resolved through the cleanup legislation. So.
Okay. We have some other comments here. Let's hear from CDE.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, Carol Bingham from the Department of Education. We do agree as a result of the changes that there will be savings in the program. We won't have good data, as was said earlier, until May or June. The savings scored in both the current and budget years seem too high to us, though. And just one final comment that, as you heard before, the superintendent supports the program as it was originally enacted.
Okay. Yeah, we we are real anxious about this program, and so, it's just going to be a subject of contention from now on. We're a little nervous about it. But I do want to open it up for any other questions from the committee. Ms. Brownlee.
Yeah, so do we, based on the LEO's recommendation on this, I would imagine that there are going to be winners and losers because, some school districts are, only taking 5% or 10% or none whatsoever, and then there are others that would be at the 30% rate. So do we have the data to break down on that to see how school districts are impacted?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we would suggest going back to the 2007-8 participation before these new penalties were in place and before a lot of districts had faced such tough budget times and had to start increasing their class sizes. Sure, we can look at the 7-8 participation data if you'd like, and by school district and see what it would look like. I mean, whenever you lock in at a particular year, there are winners and losers, and I think that's unavoidable. We were trying to hold people as harmless as possible from before things got so tough, but there would be some districts that weren't participating in 2007-8, and so therefore wouldn't be eligible for the funds now, but we could certainly find the 7-8 participation data and share it with you.
So if you go back to 2007 and 2008, if school districts weren't utilizing class size reduction, they weren't getting the funding, so they would be winners in this solution.
Right.
So they are not getting money that they would be getting now. Is that?
I think the goal of the rationale for going back to 2007-8 and saying whatever you got in 7-8, you're going to keep getting it minus 20%. So if you weren't participating in the program then, you don't get to opt in now. But if in 8-9 or 9-10 you increased your class sizes and incurred some of these penalties, you're also not going to have to carry those penalties forward or be locked in at a penalized rate. We're trying to go back to a point in time where hopefully, if you had to increase your class sizes in 8-9, but you didn't, then you're not penalized for that. It's hopefully going back to before things got so hard. But there certainly will be some winners and losers within that.
But you have to look at the current year to be able to analyze. You had said you have to go back and look at 2007, but I would think you would have to look at the current year in terms of what school districts, how they have utilized, what we have done last year.
Right.
We'd have to look at that to understand how school districts would be impacted one way or the other, right?
Compared to a current law, if our proposal as compared to current law, sure, we could do that analysis as well. I think again, if you're looking at 7-8 before they were taking any of these penalties, as compared to a 9-10 where they may be having a penalty, I would assume that 7-8 looks better for them. But it would be minus the 20%. So yeah, we could certainly do that kind of a comparison for you.
Thank you.
I'd like to open it up to the public comments. So if there are any, if you could come forward. Sergeants will direct you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Bob Blattner on behalf of Fresno, Elk Grove, a bunch of school districts. One technical piece, and let me start with thanking Assemblymember Chesbro for taking up the issue of CSR funding in 2008-9 for those districts that got pinched after the rules changed after the fact and weren't allowed to true up their actual participation. So thanks for that. On the technical item, we did a informal survey of about 30 large districts and came up with numbers that we believe are much closer to finances. And I think one of the reasons there technically is that if you raise your class size from 20 to 30 under the current flex provisions, you do get hit with a 30% penalty. But on top of that, there's another significant penalty which brings additional savings to the state, and that's that you are only funded for your first 20 kids. So currently, if you have 3 classes of 20, you have 3 packages of $21,420, right? Under the new proposal, if you go to 2 classes of 30, you only get 2 packages of the $21,420. So there is a huge drop-off in the number of kids who generate the dollars. After that lesser amount is done, then you take the 30% penalty on top. And so we believe that there are going to be approaching $500 million in savings in the current year. Thank you.
Stephen Rhodes. Two issues I'd like to talk about on this one. The first is the Ledge Analyst Office recommendation to put it in the flex item. And you hit it on some of the questions hit this issue, is that you put it in the flex item, schools can walk away from this program completely and still continue to get funding for it. And I'm not too, that's a big major policy change. This also happens with school transportation. Because those are two programs where you're funded for doing something. And if you put it in the flex item, then schools will be able to walk away from this program, walk away from school transportation, and still continue to get funding for it. And so I would urge you to think about that. The other item has to do with the 20% cuts. In general, if you look at the cuts, and I'm doing some work on this, in 2008-9 and 2009-10, it was poor kids that got cut. They got cut the most, much more so than other children in the state. And they got cut primarily because of that 20% cut that you made to categorical programs. And I would urge you not to make any more cuts to the categorical program.
In what way were they cut differently? The poor
well,
kids?
you cut programs like that service their needs, like TIG and like any other categorical. They're aimed for special needs of children, EIA program and so forth. And when you cut that program by 20%, it was those kids that got cut.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, members, Jeff Frost, representing the California Association of Suburban School Districts. We're one of the co-sponsors of Mr. Chesborough's bill, so I wanted to speak to his request to keep this item open. We also believe that, as the Department of Finance has said, there will be very significant savings in the current year and even larger savings in the budget year. Anecdotally, my 40 or so suburban districts, probably 80% of them are headed to 29 in the budget year just because of the January budget. They have to presume that those cuts are going to happen. And so 29 creates the largest amount of savings. And CSR is really one of the only programs where they can create some savings locally. To the LAO's proposal about a 20% cut and put it in Tier 3, I think there are issues of winners and losers, as Ms. Brownlee said, but it probably is the one program where every one of my districts is united in saying, give us some level of greater flexibility in that program. So we would urge you to continue to consider those options. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sandy Silberstein, representing Riverside County Schools, and we support Assemblyman Chesborough's bill. We're one of the co-sponsors as well. Basically, what that bill is, does is clean up the base year. When the February deal was struck as to what the base year would be for CSR, an agreement was reached that it would be based on 8-9 applications. That created some weird anomalies out there because districts had not planned on that number, and many of them underestimated, how many classes. So they actually had a higher base year than is current law reflected. And so we'd like to see that bill move before any action's taken so that at least their base year funding is what it was intended with the February deal. And then number two, the other issue with regard to the LAO proposal about moving CSR into flexibility, we would basically agree with that. As the prior speaker said, this is the one program where they spend a lot of time honestly making fiscal decisions rather than educational decisions for kids because they're trying to work with that penalty structure, and in some cases it actually incentivizes you to go higher than you would normally in order to retain more dollars. And so we believe that maximum flexibility, they'll make decisions. They're trying to keep their classes as small as possible. We think maximum flexibility allows them to do it. Thank you.
Madam Chair, members, I'm Mike Ricketts. I represent the County Superintendents of Schools. We represent all 58 county superintendents across the state. We're also a member of the Education Coalition and are here to testify on behalf of the coalition on a number of issues. On this particular issue, what I'd like to say is to keep in mind that you made cuts to education as part of the budget that was enacted in July that were significant reductions. You've made cuts in the year before that. You gave flexibility through categorical flexibility, making cuts and then providing some categorical flexibility, and then you relaxed penalties on CSR. The biggest winner for the relaxed penalties on CSR is the state. The locals gained some relief, and that's why class sizes have gone up. But they've increased class sizes because of the budget cuts that have been made. It's the only way that they can accommodate those cuts and still balance their budget. And so the biggest winner here is the state. So when you talk about recapturing savings that suddenly appear in these appropriations, don't think that these are savings that just magically appear. These are savings that reflect additional cuts that were made locally in order to balance their budgets, and the state just reaps the benefit of that. So thank you. And I also wanted to ask, we actually have some comments on behalf of the coalition for a number of the issues that were raised in previous testimony that you've heard today. And will there be an opportunity for us to make those comments maybe at the end after you've gone through these items?
There will be additional hearings on those issues.
Could we, though, comment on those today since you did hear those issues today earlier? I'm just thinking of, for example, federal maintenance of effort was discussed earlier, and I don't know that that will come up again. We did have a couple of comments we wanted to make on that.
You come back to comment on issues following this one. If you want to make a statement, that's fine, but we will have hearings on that earlier presentation that you'll be able to come back and make comments for.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Madam Chair. We also have some materials to hand out, and if I could, even though we won't comment on those today, if I could just give those to your sergeant and pass those out. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, Virginia Strom Martin on behalf of the Los Angeles Unified School District, and we would definitely support Assemblymember Chesbro's urging you to hold open the item on the CSR. We were one of the districts that did, in fact, underestimate, which is fairly typical of districts, our class sizes, and now we're going to have to pay for it. And with the kind of budget cuts that we're already taking, $640 million this coming year, we need every penny we can get. And this would, in fact, probably save us between $16 and $20 million. So it's very important to us. And we are also a co-sponsor of that legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers. Not to reiterate everything that my coalition partner said from the Ed Coalition, I do want to point out the policy issue that is stressed here in the class size reduction and the change in it, including the flexibility that was already provided with the reduced penalties, did change some of the policies, and we have seen class sizes drastically increasing within the state. Also to point out that to be able to cut the class size reduction money in the proposal, you would have to accept the other parts of the proposal and either suspend Prop 98 and or accept the governor's proposals reducing Prop 98 and not accepting the funding system that LAOs pointed out, which we should be funded. So in that, we would propose to oppose the other parts of the governor's budget that allow you to reduce the class size reduction. Thank you.
Dennis Myers with the California Association of School Business Officials. Just back to the issue of flexibility. That part of flexibility sunsets a year earlier than the categorical flexibility that was adopted earlier. And if there's something that we can ask you to maybe put on the table is to, whatever flexibility you adopt, whether it's current flexibility or the LAO's proposal, that you move the sunset of that at least in line with the sunset of the other flexibility so the districts can continue to prepare 2 or 3 years down the road as far as their budgets. The outlook is coming as far as, your revenue and temporary revenues are going to be sunsetting in a couple of years too. We just ask that you at least align those two sunset dates. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Liz Guillen with Public Advocates. We have concerns with the LAO's recommendation to put CSR into the categorical flexibility item for some of the same reasons that Mr. Rhodes testified to earlier. Most of the students and parents that we work with are in the lowest performing and the poorest schools and districts, and they will be affected more than other school districts if categorical flexibility is expanded and then the categoricals themselves are cut. We think that's a problem. I understand that there's a proposal that there be a cut to excess tax districts in keeping with the revenue limit cut, and it would be good to have the information about what those categoricals are that are going to be cut to align that sharing of the burden. I also want to say that we would appreciate the opportunity to be able to address and respond to some of the comments that were made this morning, especially because the partners that we work with, not only do they have skin in the game, their educational careers are, coming and going. They just don't have the time. But those comments were like shooting the messenger. And those who bear the responsibility for this problem are not those us who shed light on the problem. They're the ones who cause the problem. And to say that the governor is doing his best and still not putting revenues on the table, that's unacceptable. And it's impossible to go back to parents and students and to tell them that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else here that would like to comment on that item? Okay, then I want to make a recommendation to the members of the committee that we leave this issue open until after the May revise and go on to issue number 3. That's okay. Issue number 3, the governor's budget proposal to reduce school district revenue limit funding linked to non-instructional expenditures. We'll begin with the Department of Finance.
Thank you. Nicholas Schweitzer, Department of Finance. Although we are proposing to maintain funding at flat levels over the next couple of years, there were some one-time solutions. Most significantly, a $1.6 billion deferral that were part of the last year's budget package. Since those solutions were one time, we have to propose new solutions, new reductions to replace them. One of which is a $1.2 billion reduction that we are proposing to link to or attempt to keep from being implemented in the classroom by linking to a requirement that school districts reduce their administrative expenditures by a roughly equivalent amount. We are, though, going to propose some flexibility for those school districts that have already significantly reduced administrative costs or non-school site-based costs below a certain level, or that doing so, or that this applying this reduction solely to administration would result in fiscal insolvency for the district. We propose that those districts be allowed flexibility in the way they implement the reduction.
Okay. LAO.
Yeah, we would recommend against taking this approach. Now, you may need to make reductions to revenue limits just to if you're trying to get down to the governor's level, or if you were to be funding at any other level, you might need to make additional cuts. But we do think that this runs counter to all the flexibility that the state has been providing to school districts over the past year. We do think that at this point you should be trying to provide more flexibility for districts, and this is another restriction on them that makes it more difficult for them to make decisions that they think are best for their district. So we would recommend against taking this approach. We also think it would
against.
Yes.
Okay.
We also think that there's some difficult implementation issues. We're not sure exactly how easy it would be to keep track of what each district is doing and whether they're actually making these reductions. And either we would not really have any information and we wouldn't really be able to make sure it's implemented, or we would create these overly burdensome requirements that at this point, when we're trying to provide more flexibility, we think don't necessarily make sense.
CD.
The superintendent commented on this earlier. We would agree with the legislative analysts on this. It flies in the face of the flexibility that you had recently granted regarding a lot of the categorical programs. We think districts already have incentives to keep cuts away from the classroom. And finally, we're asking a lot more of our district-level administrative people now with all the school reform efforts as part of the new stimulus funding. So we wouldn't agree with this proposal by the administration. Finally, we haven't seen the proposed trailer bill language that would actually implement it, so it's a little hard to comment on the specifics.
Okay. Members? This is Ms. Brownlee.
I just had a couple of questions that was sort of in the text of this item, and one is around basic aid districts, and there's a consistency here on a number of these proposals about how basic aid districts, how this would apply to basic aid districts, and I was just wondering if somebody could explain it to me. I'm not sure that I really understand it.
Well, I can say the basic aid districts, we've tried to be sort of even-handed in applying all the reductions, this one plus the next two on your agenda, to both basic aid and non-basic aid districts to the extent possible. So, you know, this reduction to non-basic aid districts will be applied to their revenue limits. For basic aid districts, they would have an equivalent reduction applied to whatever categorical funding they get, to the extent they have enough categorical funding to take the reduction. So there's some limits.
So if you propose a revenue limit reduction and basic aid districts are paid through property tax, because the state doesn't have to make a contribution because they're getting excess property tax, then you're suggesting that you make cuts elsewhere to the basic aid districts of revenues that would be coming from the state.
Right. Essentially, we're proposing in last year's budget agreement a number of the reductions. There was language that tried to even-handedly apply reductions to basic aid districts, and we're proposing to essentially use the same language to apply these reductions to basic aid districts as well as non-basic aid.
So have basic aid districts been able to get COLAs over the last couple of years where other school districts haven't been able? I don't know. I honestly just don't know.
For the revenue limit piece, well, the way we calculate for the revenue limits for a basic aid or X6 tax district is to do the full calculation before we look at funding source. So we figure out what size their bucket is.
Right.
And we grow the bucket for COLA if we're growing the bucket for COLA, and then we start pouring in the funding sources. And if we pour in the property tax first, and for basic aid districts, it goes up so far, and then we pour in the general fund. For basic aids, it overflows with the property tax. So we grow the bucket for COLA each year, and that could kick them out of basic aid status if their property taxes can't fill that larger bucket, or it could continue.
But when
to do
we're
it.
reducing.
But the deficit factor, Rachel, where does that fit in there?
Yeah, so when we're reducing COLA or not providing COLA,
right?
Well, how does that,
I think we grow the bucket and then we shrink it back down for the deficit factor, right?
Okay.
So it's whatever they would get in general fund,
so
whatever their entitlement would be.
Basic aid had enough property tax to fund the COLA. We take it away from them?
No, we can never take away their property taxes.
Right. Okay. So then it seems
we would never give them general fund to fully fund a COLA if nobody else was getting a COLA.
But it just seems to me that they could indeed, the basic aid districts could indeed have received the COLA when we didn't calculate a COLA for them.
To the
for
extent
other
that
school
they're-
districts.
it would depend on the level of property taxes in the
So
community.
every basic aid district would be different. I mean, because based on their property tax.
Right.
Okay. And just the other thing is the governor's proposal including a hardship exemption. Do you want to explain that?
Sure. Again, as I said, we were going to propose some flexibility for school districts that are not able to apply this reductions entirely to their non school site based expenses. If, for example, they would be forced into insolvency, we would certainly allow them to apply the reductions more broadly. Also, if they have already reduced or their administrative costs, even before the fiscal difficulties were below a certain proportion of their total budget, then we would allow them to apply the reductions more broadly.
Okay. And I guess, I mean, it seems to me like sort of an interesting question here to know, again, sort of the data piece of, if we were going to institute this, how many districts, would this push some school districts over the edge in terms of fiscal insolvency? And if indeed it would, how many districts are we talking about? And, what is the formula by which you would analyze that insolvency piece? I mean, it's sort of a big question that actually I knew nothing about until I read the text of this item last night.
Right. We would, the way we're looking at doing it right now is currently county offices of education assess district budgets, and we would, as part of the normal county office budget approval process, we would allow a district that is facing this sort of situation to, when they submit their budget to the county office, to request a waiver from these requirements, and then the county office can evaluate that, assess that, and grant it if appropriate.
I just, it's like for some school districts, another $1 million worth of cuts to their school district could put them over the edge and put them in insolvency. So it's, it's anyway.
Can I just add, just to clarify on the hardship provisions, the exemption doesn't mean, if you qualify, that doesn't mean that you don't get cut. Everyone will get cut. It just means that now you don't have to cut non-instructional, so you don't have to only cut outside the classroom. Then you can also cut in the classroom if you qualify for this exemption. But everyone will take the cut whether they get this waiver or not, or this exemption.
Are there any other questions from members of the board, committee? Then I'd like to entertain questions from the public. If you have comments, please come forward.
I'm trying to testify. Adonai Mack with the Association of California School Administrators. So obviously we are opposed to the governor's proposal in targeting administration. I just want to point out a couple of things in my testimony. One, the data is fairly old. So we're talking about, I believe it's 08, 09 year. Is that correct, Nick? 07, 8?
We're looking at 07 or 8 data,
Okay.
although I think we've got 08, 09 data now, so we may look.
Okay, and that's
We'll want to use the most recent.
The most recent data. Gotcha. So we're looking at 07, 08 data. I can pretty much guarantee you that in 07, 08 there was not $12 billion spent on administration statewide. It was, the number they're saying is about 10% or so, or 1 point, I think it's 1.8 1.2 billion. And so you have to say that there's $12 billion being spent, which is far more than 10%. And given that at that time we're embarking on kind of the recession at that particular time, from that point forward, districts have cut the majority of their reductions from the central office. So we're talking about now you want to make an additional reduction at a central office that has already been decimated by cuts. Administrators all throughout the state specifically have been trying to take the cuts away from the classroom, and that's why we had flexibility. And then speaking of flexibility, the undersecretary spoke today, which is it's kind of interesting the schizophrenic nature that we're getting with the budget, in that she mentioned how important flexibility was in the district. So you want to mention flexibility and how important that is for districts, but then you want to turn around and have a target cut to administrators. Not to mention that the budget came out 2 days after the governor signed Race to the Top legislation. So now we have additional federal mandates as well as all the state mandates that the legislature and the governor continue to not fund. We have all these mandates that now you want to target all the folks that have to implement those mandates and do all the data as it relates to all of those mandates. So there's a lot of concern as it relates to this particular proposal targeting all my members. Finally, just another piece, this whole look at the importance of school leaders and what it means. School leaders are the ones that implement all of the reforms that come into the districts. They're also the ones that help support all of the learning and the instructional support that happens at the school site. So we need to just notice that as you're looking at making this targeted cut, which we completely oppose, recognize that it does have an impact on student achievement. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. You know, it's interesting. Yesterday, I was having this same discussion in my office with staff, and we were trying to decide whether an administrator had anything to do with instruction. And so your comments just, you know, cemented my argument that it does.
Thank you.
You know, thank you for your comments.
Thank you, ma'am. Jeff Frater with the California Federation of Teachers, and I'm also here to express the Ed Coalition's position on this and some of the others. The Ed Coalition and CFT oppose this policy to specifically the policy issue and not just the cuts. As was stated before with AXA, Mr. Mack, we're not focusing on what the issue is. The issue here is the budget. And we're trying to distract ourselves from the cuts in the budget to these policy issues. The Ed Coalition also has opposition to all of the policy changes that have been proposed, and that's the important part here, is that both sides, labor and management, you normally wouldn't probably be seeing me up here, you know, representing management, but yes, it is important that we have all the pieces together in the system, and that's the concern with all these cuts and all of these proposals. The last thing I want to say is you won't be seeing unfortunately, a lot of the Ed Coalition are meeting right now, so you won't be seeing some of the partners, but they are all here in terms of our comments.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dennis Myers with California Association of School Business Officials, again, part of the Education Coalition opposing cuts, but to this specific issue. As you have handed cuts to school districts over the last 18 months, almost counterintuitively, most of those cuts have come in the revenue limit. And we've asked for that so that decisions on cuts can be made locally. We've asked for that flexibility. This proposal runs completely counter to that as well. It is not allowing districts and communities to make the choices on the cuts that you're now proposing. It's micromanagement at an obsessive compulsive level. It really is, because the cuts that you have made to schools have equaled, what, 18–20%. District administration in the average school district is 5 to 7%. As much as we have tried to target central office, some of those cuts have to make it down the classroom. That's why we've had the conversation earlier about class sizes increasing. There is no way, with the amount of cuts that we've been dealing with and are talking about right now, that something's not going to trickle down and affect the classroom. But I just want to tell you that really local communities have been making those tough choices. They really don't need to be told by the state where to cut. And one part that really makes me angry is that we're having a public hearing on something that we have not even seen the language publicly. all we know is that we are talking maybe about some budget codes, and it may look like this, and somebody may be able to be exempted. But that just really is ticking us off, because this really is the heart and soul of what school districts are doing. Lastly, as we've heard that there's one of the budget codes in there is maintenance and operations. I just have to tell you, maintenance and operations, what is that? Maintenance and operations is pretty much dealt with by square footage. And if you've got a 5,000 square foot district office and you've got 500,000 square feet of classroom space, how can you consider at the state level that maintenance operation is not a school site charge? So let's not get into that level of detail here. I would just hope that you would send a strong message to school districts right now to separate the issue. Vote this part down, defer the cuts till May revise, but districts really need to kind of move on with making their plans and know that this ridiculous proposal isn't going to see the light of day out of this House. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, at the risk of making light of some very serious testimony, so now we've got OCMM, excessive compulsive micromanagement.
I think you can put that in the code there, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, Bob Blattner again. A few points. I believe I have seen some language on this targeting certain SACS function codes. And first of all, I would like to say that SACS the standard account code structure for the state is a very difficult tool to use well and an impossible tool to use perfectly. And as Dennis just said about M&O, for instance, you can't split it out by site versus central office. So just technically, this is a hard thing to do. But I think there's some other issues there that are deeper than just technical problems that make it impossible. The first is that, as far as we can tell, we are determining sort of an average California administrative cost. And then the districts above average are bad, and the districts below average are righteous. Okay? Now, first of all, that doesn't even take into account that, according to Ed data, California has about 1/3 of the national average in central office administrators and about 2/3 in site administrators. So we start at a pretty low beam. Then we're all of a sudden saying, guess what? If you are unrighteous and spend dollars on these certain things, you have to cut those. Well, if we look at what is targeted, these are the very things that the Race to the Top application and Sanction 6 at the State Board of Education say that districts need to do to improve. For instance, much of the professional development for teachers, PD for principals and assistant principals, evaluating the effectiveness of education programs, supervising and evaluating classroom instruction, on and on. Instructional support, IT, collective bargaining. Much of what we're going to have to do is going to have to be collectively bargained. That's part of the thing that we have to cut down now. It's just crazy. And if you look at our Race to the Top application, it said that the way we're going to improve our schools is by, quote, ensuring more timely information on student learning to inform instruction. That's going to be cut. Building an infrastructure to support the use of data to drive decisions. It's going to be cut. Developing and supporting effective teachers and school leaders. That's going to be cut. Strengthening the rigor and relevance of schools that are not meeting student needs. All of these things are being cut. And last but not least, it's like the bed of Procrustes. No matter how big you were coming into the inn, Procrustes would stretch you out so you met his bed, or he'd chop you down so you met the bed. There are school districts, Newport Mesa and Orange County passed its last school bond by saying we are going to guarantee 4% going to M&O for our schools that we're building with your money. That will be cut. There's another school district, I think one of the best in the state, that has all of its support centrally so they can keep absolute track on effectiveness, Clovis Unified. They're going to get hammered by this. So for so many reasons, this should be a non-starter. We appreciate the fact that schools are about classrooms and teachers, but it's not just about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna save the concerns about righteousness for Sunday, but Ernie Silva on behalf of SciATech, the School for Integrated Academics and Technologies. We are a dropout recovery high school. We have one of the hardest populations to serve, and as much energy as we put in making sure our site level is well taken care of, we have partnerships with the federal government, with Job Corps and other federal agencies that require administration beyond what SACS code is going to lead to. We also do a lot of work with technology. Our population does well with high tech and understanding. These are all costs that are centralized. We see this as a very inadvisable approach as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Michael Holsizer here today again on behalf of our school districts in Kern County, 47 serving about 170,000 students. I'd like to say this feels a little bit like beating a dead horse, but given the fact that this is the governor's proposal, as long as it's his proposal and he continues to keep it on the table, no matter how righteous the arguments were here today, it doesn't go away, and so we do need to speak to it. I'm here to tell you this proposal feels very cruel and very ironic to the 47 school districts in my county. We worked very closely with this administration a year ago to obtain the flexibility that the undersecretary spoke to earlier. We encouraged you as a legislature to enact those flexibility reforms and allow us to move money away from important categorical programs to protect site-based expenditures, and we did that in 08-09. This proposal doesn't give us any credit for doing that. My districts have saved hundreds of teaching jobs and site-based jobs in the last year as a result of the flexibility that the governor proposed and we supported. This proposal, it's very hurtful to these people who've done exactly what the administration and you've asked them to do, which is to protect sites. General administration, which is what the governor would want us to target, funds district librarians. It funds nurses. It funds security officers. It funds the things that Mr. Blattner referenced. We've already cut those things. We've already eliminated deferred maintenance. And yet, this proposal would suggest that somehow we can cut it again. As one of my superintendents said to some of you 2 weeks ago, you can only cut something once. So we would just ask you to reject this proposal. We'd ask the administration to acknowledge that perhaps it was well-intentioned, but it was in closer examination not appropriate, and to remove it. We understand we have to be cut. We've been cut disproportionately. We've made those arguments to you before. Let's, as it was said by the CASBO representative, let's put aside the revenue limit cut for that has to be dealt with. It may revise. But this policy proposal needs to be taken off the table. Our districts are preparing second interim budgets right now. They don't know what to cut. They've already cut these things, and yet under the governor's proposal, they've got to cut them again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Sandy Silberstein, representing Riverside County Schools. I don't know what there is to add. My colleagues have been very eloquent on this issue. I just want to maybe point out one thing that Mr. Holsizer just said. We develop our budgets based on the governor's January budget. To the extent that you can take early action to take this off the table and send a signal to the field that they don't have to start whacking some programs that they just don't see how they can do, it would be extremely helpful in their budget development process. They have deadlines that come far before your final decisions will be made, but early action indicating that you are willing to take this off the table from a legislative perspective would be hugely helpful at the local level in budget development. The proposal lacks context. It doesn't look at what we've done. It doesn't look at the bigger picture. And the main thing it's not looking at, which is very troubling to me, is that about a decade ago, we changed the rules for education. We said we're going to move to an outcome-based system. We're going to move to accountability. We're going to measure your outcomes, your student achievement. And then last year you took a huge leap forward by removing some of the input-based requirements that we had, by giving us flexibility. And you said the goal's still here. You get there best you can. That's what we're doing. And for you to now, not you, but for the governor now to propose to start telling us what the inputs will be, telling us again, moving back to what inputs will be, taking the eye off the goal of outcomes and student achievement, that ties our hands so we can't meet that bar. So again, I urge you to reject this proposal.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Good morning, Barrett Snyder on behalf of the School Employers Association of California and the Saddleback Valley Unified School District. It's all been said, but I just want to highlight that we've had dramatic cuts. Last year we passed Race to the Top legislation that requires all school districts in this state to administer the parent empowerment and open enrollment. That there are requirements, regardless of whether we are funded for Race to the Top, these school districts are going to have to comply with. That's all administrative stuff. So this cut coming from the governor, who is pushing the Race to the Top legislation to now cut the very people that need to do that work, it's very significant, and we would, for all the reasons mentioned, encourage you to oppose this proposal. Thank you.
I'm Steve Rhodes, representing San Bernardino and Santa Ana and LA. I'm actually going to talk about something entirely different, and that's the basic aid questions that were raised. In the past, basic aid, COLAs and so forth were completely determined by their property tax. They were property tax rich. If a property tax went up by 10%, that's the amount of money that they received. And so sometimes they didn't take the cuts. Lately, because of the decline in property tax, they've had to make some reductions. For the districts I represent, it's important that you make a fair reduction to the basic aid districts. You can actually do this through switching property tax, or you can do it through cuts to the categorical programs. And the reason it's important is because if you don't make those reductions, then you're going to have to cut my districts more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Joshua Golko with the California School Employees Association and also a member of the Education Coalition. We too are opposed to the governor's policy proposals.
Thank you.
Good morning, Liz Guillen with Public Advocates. We're opposed to the governor's proposal on this revenue limit piece, but with regard to thinking about how to address the excess tax district or the basic aid district situation, cutting categoricals overall is not the route we would prefer to go. And the idea that we can never take away property taxes, we quibble with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for your comments, and thank you, members of the committee. You know, as the LAO points out, it's unclear how the governor's proposal would be implemented and how feasible it is for districts to take this level of cuts in these areas. And so, you know, it's for this reason that I recommend the subcommittee takes the following action, that we reject the governor's policy proposal to link a reduction in school district revenue limits to specific non-instructional expenditure reductions and delay action on specific revenue limit reductions until after the May revision. So I'd like to have a motion, if I may. Second, Mr. Chesbrough. Yeah. You are going to come back to us at some point, huh? Yeah. Okay, I have a motion and a second. Secretary, would you please call the roll?
Carter.
Aye.
Berryhill. Brownlee. Chesbrough.
Aye.
Fuller. Swanson.
We will leave the roll open for absent members.
Can I just get a clarification? So the motion that we just made and voted on is addresses the concerns that were just expressed here.
Exactly.
And okay, so we're going to deal with this budget with the
issue.
Well, the policy issue is completely taken out of this now, so that everyone can go back to their districts to say that this proposal is, we've taken action on this particular proposal. Thank you.
Issue 4, the governor's budget proposal to reduce school district revenue limits, funding linked to changes in contracting out policy. This is my favorite one, Department of Finance.
Okay. So again, in an effort to keep the cuts away from the classroom and to provide, in this case, provide some additional flexibility to school districts in order to absorb the reductions. We have a $300 million reduction, again, applied to revenue limits and for basic aid districts applied to their categorical programs. And then linked to this, we have a proposal to amend or to eliminate some restrictions in current statute that limit school districts' ability to contract out. Specifically, we're proposing to eliminate a requirement that any savings or that the contracting out cannot be done on the sole basis of savings that would result from reduced personnel costs, restrictions that require that the contractor's wages be roughly equivalent to the school district pay rates, and the reduction and the requirement that the contract not displace any district employees.
So what happens if the $300 million cannot be realized from these changes in policy?
The school districts would still have the $300 million reduction. So they're not. It's we don't.
The deduction would just be given to them?
Right. Well, they will still have the reduction. It's just the linkage is that, along with the reduction, we're proposing some flexibility to help them absorb that reduction. So the reduction would apply. They would receive a reduction if they choose, not to do more contracting out, or if they do more contracting out, but it doesn't result in the same amount of savings. Also, if they do more if the contracting out results in more savings, we're not proposing to take more from them either.
Oh, I see. Elio.
Yeah, we have kind of a split record on this. We do think that we think that you should have kind of two separate conversations, one about the funding and one about the policy itself. So we do think that it makes sense to provide additional flexibility to school districts. So we would support adopting the changes in language that would allow school districts some more freedom for contracting out. But we don't think that you should link it to this $300 million cut. As you brought up, we don't really know what the actual savings will be in the field. We don't know if it would add up to $300 million. We think that's a pretty high estimate, and we think it's unlikely that they would actually be able to save that much statewide. But also, the savings will be different from district to district, and so to provide a cut to all school districts equally, when some of them may not benefit from this additional flexibility, we don't think makes sense. Now, again, you might have to make the reduction anyways to balance your budget, but we just think there should be two separate conversations, one about what flexibility you want to provide, and then one about how much funding you need to provide.
CD, can I just have her comments first? Okay.
Yeah, we also don't think it makes much sense to tie the reduction in the budget to the contracting proposal. With respect to the contracting proposal itself, we don't have any comments.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Brownlee.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to state for the record, first, school districts already have the ability to contract out. And second, I haven't seen really any data that shows in most cases that it pencils out in terms of the savings. In fact, I've seen data to show that it can many times be more expensive. So I'm not sure that this I'm not sure what the governor is really trying to do here to give schools the flexibility to contract out when they already have the ability to contract out. So, Madam Chair, I would certainly suggest that we take similar action on this item that we did on the previous item.
Thank you. Now, are there any comments from the public on this item?
Madam Chair, Dennis Myers with CASBO. We appreciate the comments so far because it looks like you're kind of heading where we would suggest. I'm representing speaking for the Education Coalition on this one too. We would respectfully ask that you separate the two issues out. The whole issue of contracting out belongs in a policy committee where you can hash out over hours and hours of discussion what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. But related to the budget, translate this. It's not $300 million. It's $50 per kid. And we can't even see how you would save $50 per ADA through any kind of reform or change to contracting out laws. And that's coming from the management side here. So talk about the cut later, but to separate the issues, we'd appreciate it again and just kind of make it more realistic. This is really about the cut, not about any kind of savings you would get from contracting out. So thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, could you keep your comments to like 1 minute?
Certainly. Joshua Golko with the California School Employees Association, also a member of the Education Coalition, in opposition to the governor's proposal, and we would urge you to reject it as suggested by Assemblymember Brownlee. We also feel that the existing law currently just provides accountability and transparency for when districts do decide that they are going to contract out, and now more than ever, under the current fiscal conditions that districts are facing, they need those protections to ensure that their dollars are being spent wisely. We also think that the $300 million in savings purported by the governor's proposal is not just overly optimistic or unlikely as characterized by the LAO, but we think it's pure fantasy. And even the $50 to $250 million suggested by the LAO we think is unrealistic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, Caitlin Vega for the California Labor Federation, also here in opposition. I'd simply add that in our view, much of the reason for the crisis we face right now is the economic recession that we are in and the extremely high rate of unemployment that California workers are facing. This proposal essentially seeks to lay off more workers. It's promoting the displacement of current workers, which to us is the opposite of what we should be doing at this time to try to help our economy recover. It seems like it's taking us in the worst direction possible, so we're here in opposition.
Thank you.
Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers in opposing the policy issue here. And just to point out that as you do more contracting out or more privatizing as the governor is pushing for, you have less or fewer employees that are vested in the education system, and you have more people that don't really know what's going on with the school district coming in and doing these jobs. And it's important to have a consistent adult supervision and adult interaction with these students to continue and improve that education system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Name Mack with State AXA. We're also opposed to this piece in the governor's budget. I'd like to echo all the comments by CASBO and CFT and CSEA. We'd just like to note also that this is the same number, the $300 million that was used in 2005. I can't imagine that the number hasn't changed in 5 years. Thank you.
Thanks.
Steve Rhodes, representing the School Transportation Coalition. We actually support the policy and the comments made by Edgar. However, we're not opposed at all to your proposal. Cutting the revenue limit by $50 a kid is ridiculous, and we would request that you table that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Did you have an additional comment? Okay. I, too, think that it's not fair to school districts to link these changes in policy to savings that may or may not be achieved. So it is for that reason that I recommend the subcommittee take the following action. Reject the governor's policy proposal to make changes to current law governing school contracting out and delay action on specific revenue limit reductions until after the May revision. I'd like a motion, please.
So moved.
Ms. Brownlee, second by Mr. Swanson. Secretary, please take the roll.
Carter.
Aye.
Berryhill. Brownlee.
Aye.
Chesbro. Fuller. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
We will be leaving the roll open for absent members to come in. Issue 5, the governor's budget proposal to reduce County Office of Education revenue limit funding linked to consolidation. Department of Finance.
Yes, this proposal is to achieve $45 million in savings from consolidation of some of the functions and services county offices of education provide. We're planning on sort of getting together with the county offices of education and other interested parties to explore options and develop a flushed out proposal to do this in the coming weeks.
Okay. LAO.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We think that the idea has some merit to look at county offices and are there ways that they can work more closely together, achieve greater efficiencies, and collaborate, particularly some of the areas where the county offices are very small and maybe could work together. They already do some things on a regional level. So certainly exploring the idea with the County Superintendents Association and others makes sense. We offered another suggestion to take it, to put it a little bit more structured, which would be to cut each county office by a lesser amount than the governor proposes, only 10% instead of 15%, and then take an additional 10% and pool it together with other counties in their region to create kind of a pooled regional county revenue limit, to create some structure for them to come together and greater again, greater sources to work together to try and achieve that. So we'll work together with the working group and see what happens.
Good. CD?
We think that providing tools and incentives for further development of consolidated services seems like a good idea. However, there is a lot of sharing of services going on already, and the effect of the proposal is probably going to be just an unallocated cut for a number of county offices.
Committee members?
Yeah, Madam Chair, can I ask the Finance Office, if you haven't met with the county offices yet, where did the $45 million figure come from?
The $45 million was just sort of an assessment we made of what could potentially be achieved. Admittedly, there isn't a lot of science behind it, but
you just grabbed a number.
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
5, 45, 50, 55.
Wouldn't go that far, but
okay, I got it.
Sure, we will certainly relook at that number after we talk to the county offices and other folks.
Yeah, I mean, at some point we really have to look at the substantive question of purpose. What is being accomplished, or what, in your opinion, is not being accomplished? But it has to be based in something for us to have credibility on these questions when we just come up with a number. And it just anyway.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Ms. Brownlee.
Well, this is, this particular topic. I mean, in terms of county offices of education, I'm very familiar with LACO, Los Angeles County Office of Education, but my understanding is that LACO is kind of, more the exception than the rule in terms of how other county offices of education works. Relative to what, the LAO is suggesting here, whether in terms of the potential of consolidating programs on a regional basis, I don't know too much about who is the arbiter of regional programs and how that all sort of works. I have a feeling that this is it. We're not going to get back to this. I mean, are we going to drill down on this issue anymore, or is this it in terms of what the committee will be looking at relative to this proposal and the governor's proposal? Is this, is this the one issue at the one time?
I think the hope is that if this working group can get together in the coming weeks, that potentially there could be something before
that
you.
They would flush out
something else.
some kind of
Something before you around the May revision.
After the May revision, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Mike Ricketts with the County Superintendents of Schools, and appreciate many of the comments that have been made by Assemblymember Swanson and other members so far. This is the last proposal in $1.5 billion worth of cuts that you're considering today. The governor's representatives yesterday reiterated again that there are no cuts to education in his budget proposal, that education is being held harmless. So how are we talking about $1.5 billion cuts? Education Coalition yesterday announced 22,000 teacher layoffs, 10,000 classified employee layoffs, 1,000 administrators, but we have a no-cuts budget. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, it's because we actually have a fig leaf budget. All of the proposals that you've heard so far that the administration has brought forward, there's the fig leaf that these aren't really cuts because there's a way to achieve savings. $1.2 billion in administrative costs, $300 million from savings through relaxed restrictions on contracting out, $45 million from regionalization of services for county superintendents of schools and the work that they do throughout the state. These are just fig leaves. And I have to say I'm really disappointed that the legislative analyst, having exposed the other proposals as being nothing but fig leaves, instead tries to turn this fig leaf into a suit of clothes. This is not any different than any of the other cuts that have been proposed. There are no $45 million in savings that anybody has identified through regionalization of services. So to give this the credibility that somehow this proposal actually results in savings to county offices and the $45 million that's proposed isn't a real cut to services is offensive actually to us, because it is a real cut in services. There are no $45 million in savings through regionalization. That said, we're happy to talk about regionalization of services. We already operate in 11 regions. The counties themselves, 58 counties, we've got almost 1,000 school districts. We've got 400 charter schools or more. I lose count of that. But we've got 58 counties. They are regions. They provide regional services right now. I could go through the list of regional services that counties already provide, and I can give that to you if you'd like to hear it. But the point is, we work in a regional way, and we do it voluntarily. We also work statewide. The 58 county superintendents work on issues that are statewide issues that affect everybody in the state, and they collaborate on a statewide basis. So we do this voluntarily where it makes sense. Where there are savings to be had, I can guarantee you that we're doing it. We're happy to talk more about that. We'd like the opportunity to educate legislative analyst staff as well as Department of Finance staff on what we do in the regionalization area, but we would like you to take the same action with this proposal that you've taken with the previous proposals and to reject it, because it really is just a fig leaf that the governor's proposed to identify a $45 million cut as really just a savings. So we'd ask you to reject that proposal.
Thank you for your comments, but I just can't get that fig leaf out of my mind right here. But I did hear what you said.
Okay.
Still looking at the fig leaf. Yeah.
Okay. So I had one last comment. The $45 million cut is 15% at least to county offices, and we think it's disproportionate relative to other areas of the budget. If we know we have to take our share of a cut if there's going to be a cut, but it should be proportional. If you look at the $1.5 billion cut that was made on a one-time basis this year, $17 million of that fell to counties. So this is a significant increase in the cut going forward. So we'd like to talk about what's the right amount if there is going to be a cut. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dennis Myers with CASBO. Obviously, Madam Chair, you're a visual person, so let's call it a Trojan horse. Okay, that's probably a little better visually. On behalf of the Education Coalition, just as Mr. Ricketts said, we ask that you would separate the issues out. If you're going to talk about cuts later. On a policy issue, it just doesn't really pencil out. County offices are regional and special ed services, regional occupational centers and programs, payroll, risk management. Almost everything they do is regional in nature. But to have that discussion is to take more time than what you have, and really belongs at the policy level.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning. Barrett Snyder on behalf of a number of county offices of education, including San Diego, Santa Clara, San Bernardino, El Dorado, and Sonoma County Office of Ed. There's sort of been a theme here where it's, I don't know, growing up we did these things from book club where they're ad libs and you had a story and you just fill in a verb or something to make the story. It seems like that's kind of what's going on with the budget, where people just come up with stuff and then insert whatever number they feel like they want to put in there. And that's clearly the case with this proposal with the $45 million. There's an incredible lack of specificity on how you would implement this. For example, if you were to integrate, I've been talking to some of our county soups, if you're going to integrate just payroll systems alone, different counties use different payroll systems. So somebody somewhere is going to have to buy new software, potentially new hardware. that washes away any potential savings you have on integrating just a payroll system with buying new software. $45 million, you can get pretty close to that statewide if you try and do that. We would also like to highlight the point the CDE made that a lot of this collaboration is already going on, and Mr. Ricketts alluded to being able to provide a list of that. And so for those reasons, we would encourage you to take the similar action on this item as you have on the others. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sandy Silverstein, representing Riverside County Office of Education. Again, we would agree. Please delink any cuts you have to make to county offices from the policy proposal. We think the issue of regionalization is being handled extremely well at the local level, and really one of the reasons it's happening is because there are so many cuts, and we really are doing it locally and voluntarily in the places that it works for us, where it results in savings and where it results in better outcomes for kids. We think to try to come up with a model about how all counties should regionalize at the state level is probably not going to work very well. And so we urge you to think about, again, devolving to the local level decisions about regionalization, and we'll make the right decisions for kids because we have to reach the accountability bars that you've set for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers. Repeating our opposition, as everyone has said, I just want to point out I guess the irony in the governor's proposal this year. And in the past, he's provided flexibility with categoricals, and this year he's trying to target specific cuts and trying to limit what the school districts can do. And again, just want to tell you our opposition to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Danny Mack with AXA. Again, not to reiterate everyone else's comments, we're also opposed, and we agree with everything that Michael Rickers from Successful was saying. Those are the exact same points that we wanted to make this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joshua Golko with the California School Employees Association, also in opposition.
Thank you so much. Did you have a comment, Mr. Swanson?
Yeah, what we're finding in this environment where we're looking at cuts, adjustments, flexibility, is that all adjustments, all cuts are not the same. And sometimes they could actually end up costing the budget more money in the long run. If local districts are not consulted or not engaged in the debate. And so we do have a fiduciary responsibility here to make sure that as we proceed, that it's not only thoughtful, but in fact, in the end, we have the anticipated results. And I just think that we have to show a lot of care there. Now, I've seen, in other parts of the budget, I've seen cuts that have been proposed to save the state money that in fact are costing the state a lot of money. And so I just think we have to be careful on how we move forward. And this is pretty serious business here. And I think that the county offices, and as well as every school district, is doing the absolute best they can to make sure that they are not having our children suffer in terms of the quality of education that they receive from this current recession and environment. And that's why we should be looking for more revenues, because they are doing as much as they can. Anyway, I just wanted to, it's just very frustrating when, and I think that the work has to be done. The governor's office, in my opinion, the finance office, I think we all have some responsibility to do the hard work. It's not easy. I mean, it's easy to pick a number, but it's not easy to actually dig down and make a substantive recommendation based on some supportable facts.
Mr. Berryhill, did you have a comment on this item? No. Okay. Well, I agree that consolidation of county offices may have merit, but such major policy changes should be fully vetted through a working group or the legislative bill process. So I encourage county offices of education to assist the legislature in crafting ideas to help streamline activities wherever it's possible. So it is for this reason that I recommend the subcommittee take the following action. Reject the governor's policy proposal to link a reduction to county office of education revenue limits to county office consolidations, and delay action on specific revenue limit reductions until after the May revision. And I'd like a motion, please.
Second.
Mr. Swanson moved and Ms. Brownlee second. Call the roll, please.
Carter,
Aye.
Berryhill, Brownlee,
Aye.
Chesbro,
Aye.
Fuller, Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Thank you. Motion passed. Our last issue today, the governor's budget proposal to apply negative cost of living adjustment. Department of Finance, please.
Yes, this year the COLA happens to be a negative. As a result, we are proposing to apply that adjustment to both revenue limits and categorical programs.
Okay, the LAO.
Madam Chair, in the past 2 years, the legislature has waived the COLA for K-12 education and community colleges. It's the same COLA index. As your agenda says, it was a 5.66% in 2008-9 that was not provided, and 4.25% in 2009-10. We don't think it's reasonable to waive COLAs for 2 years and then go in and provide a negative COLA. Again, you may have to take the cut to balance your budget, but we would suggest not linking it to this policy, and not suggesting that school districts are facing lower costs after they have not kept pace with inflation in recent years.
Thank you. CDE.
We agree with the LAO on this one.
Oh, okay. Members of the subcommittee, Ms. Brownlee.
Yeah, I just have to make one comment, and I just think, for the Department of Finance, I think it's just insensitive and the way in which you present this to say, this year, we just happen to have a negative COLA. This hasn't happened in 60 years or over 60 years. I don't know, but I just, it's not just, it just sort of happens. It does, this is, sort of an unprecedented sort of happening. And of course, we haven't been, providing COLAs over the last couple of years as budget reduction measures. So I just ask to be a little bit more sensitive.
I'm sorry for any insensitivity that may have. I assure you, we in the administration take all these reductions very seriously. I just note, as you said, that this is not the usual thing to have a negative COLA. However, we do believe it's warranted to implement that COLA.
Any other members? Comments? Comments from the public?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dennis Myers with CASBO and the Education Coalition. We're obviously opposed to this for many other reasons, but we just want to point out to you that the only way you can do this is if you adopt the manipulations to 98 and other things, or suspend 98 because of the deal and the budget that you put together in July. It kind of specifies where 98 is, and to do this would cause you to have to go back on that agreement. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff Freitas with California Federation of Teachers, and we agree with the previous speaker, as well as opposing reducing the deficit factor, because the school districts have lost money over the last several years. We haven't kept up with the pace to increase that burden down the road, and not paying back what we have lost in actual dollars would be the wrong thing to do.
Thank you.
Joshua Golka with the California School Employees Association, also in opposition for the reasons previously stated.
Thank you so much. If there are no other comments from the members, I want to thank you all. Mr. Swanson?
A negative COLA is an oxymoron. Go ahead.
Very good, Mr. Swanson. On that note, I recommend that we hold this issue until after the May revision. Oh. Okay. Why do we need to go back? think we had, we needed to call the roll.
Berryhill.
The motion was?
Motion.
To reject the governor's policy proposal to link a reduction in school district revenue limits to specific non-instructional expenditure reductions and delay action on specific revenue limit reductions until after the May revision.
Berryhill. Fuller. Swanson.
Swanson, aye.
Is there another one? Which one?
Yeah, so issue 4 and that
4?
issue passed.
Okay. She'll go back and add on later.
Okay. I was just a little lost. Oh, okay. Okay, so issue 4.
4.
Issue 4.
This policy proposal to make changes to current law governing school contracting out and delay action until after the May revision.
Berryhill. Chesbro. Fuller.
Was there others?
Yeah, there's one more, but the vote's 4-2.
Measure passed.
Issue 5.
This was issue 5, reject the governor's policy proposal to link a reduction to County Office of Education revenue limits to County Office consolidation and delay that action until after May revision.
It passed.
Call the roll. I'd like to make a note that the next K-12 hearing will be April 6th. We'll take a closer look at the impacts of the cuts on our schools, and I encourage testimony that helps us understand how the legislators' actions has helped or hurt schools, and if there is anything that the legislature can do to ease that pain. We've talked about a lot of pain today. And so I hope between April 6th and now that we think about what we're doing here. Mr. Swanson.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I was just wondering, I know we have caucus in 10 minutes, but if there were, if the chair would entertain any public comment that was general in nature, that on some of the early items that people that are still here that wanted to enter into the record, if they would be allowed a minute to do that.
There were 2 or 3 people who wanted to comment on earlier items and who had some information they wanted to leave.
If there's anyone.
While they're coming up, may I say, Madam Chair, I'm sure that I came in a little late, so I'm sure somebody else said this already, but we sure are glad you're back.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I've learned a lot today, I tell you. I just...
Yeah.
Excuse me just a moment. I'm trying to find my notes here.
And which item were you commenting on?
I'm Mike Ricketts, County Superintendent of Schools, and here on behalf of the Education Coalition, there were just a couple of things that were brought up earlier. I did leave for handouts, and I think you got a copy of the letter, the budget letter that the Education Coalition has actually been handing around, so this is probably your second or third copy, but anyway, you have one. Also, a copy of the press release that's in pink that was walked around yesterday that just highlights the actual cuts that are being taken. And I think we made this point earlier, but want to make it again. These are real cuts to schools. You all know that, and I think you're going to talk at future hearings about the impact of this, and we appreciate that opportunity to really share with you what's happening at the school level in terms of the impact of these reductions on education for students. maintenance of effort waiver application, you heard testimony from Kathy Gaither earlier on this issue, and I just wanted to say that although it sounded like from what she said that they have some assurance from the federal government that this is kind of a slam dunk, that they're going to approve this waiver request, even though they did question it. The coalition raised a number of issues with the waiver, and I think if they approve it, they've got to do it with kind of a wink and a nod, because just for example, the governor proposes to pre-fund a portion of the QIA payment for 2010-11 in 2009-10, specifically to meet the maintenance of effort requirement that the federal government has set. In other words, the state will be below that level unless they move money from 2010-11 into 2009-10. And the rationale that the that the response was that the governor made to that inquiry from the Department of Education was that, well, that's money that's actually just discretionary money. It's not really linked to the requirements that go along with the QIA program. So we can give it to you in any year we want, and we can call it money for that year. Well, the fact is that that's almost like being in Alice in Wonderland. You know, that money is to fund the requirements of that program. In some cases, doesn't even fully fund it, but nonetheless, that money has to be used to fund the provisions of the program, and to say that we're going to just move that money into 2009-10 and say that meets maintenance of effort in this year, when in fact it is I think everybody acknowledges money that will have to be used by schools, even if technically the requirement isn't there in 2010-11. Shows it to be just a straight-up manipulation. If the federal government approves that, well, then that's where we are, I guess. But we wanted to point out that that the budget, and as well as the federal maintenance of effort waiver, includes a number of manipulations in order to reduce 98, in order to meet these minimum requirements in ways that are truly end up cutting schools further. So it's a concern that we've got, and we hope that the federal government challenges the governor on that basis. But we wanted to clarify that there are real issues here, and there are real manipulations that are going on, whether or not that MOE proposal gets approved, or waiver proposal gets approved or not. And the last thing that I wanted to comment on, there was a mention that school districts are holding federal dollars that have been allocated already. There's two things that are going on there. One is that school districts have actually allocated those dollars to fund positions. So they have saved a number of teaching and other positions in this year and in next year. But for this year, you can show those dollars as being expended only when you've paid the teacher. So you won't see the full use of those dollars till the end of the year, because even though they've been committed, they haven't been spent. So there's been this issue of districts, are they actually spending this money? They are spending it. The second thing, though, is that some may be holding it as a hedge against 2010-11 cuts. And part of that has to do with whether or not the state lives up to its commitments. And I think one of the issues this last year, when the 2010-9-10 budget in July was enacted, there was a deal that was included in that had to do with the certification of the Proposition 98 level. It had to do with the maintenance factor and maintenance factor repayment. But more than anything, it had to do with giving districts some certainty about the level of funding that they could depend on going forward, knowing they had to take a certain amount of cuts, but knowing that there would be a stable base of funding going forward. And so that would allow them to spend federal funds. It would allow them to actually plan for spending dollars. Now the governor proposes going back on that deal, which puts the districts in a position where they don't know where they're going to be. And so it freezes districts. It causes them to have to try and plan for greater reductions than they otherwise might have to, just because they don't know where they'll stand. So it's real important to us that that agreement be sustained, because it really did send a signal to the field that that the state was willing to make a commitment, even with cuts, to say that we're going to cut you this much, but you can count on that level of cuts being what you have to absorb, and you can plan going forward. So
thank you.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers, and I'll stand back here and keep it real short. I wanted to address two issues that were brought up earlier that were not on the list. One of them was race to the top. First of all, I want to say do not try to address race to the top to fix our financial situation. It is not enough money to be able to do that, and that would be the one reason why it would be in this committee, as well as all of you, I believe, sit on the Education Committee. The second of all is if there are any actions on race to the top, wait until we find out why we got what points we got or what points we didn't get. And the third reason kind of goes along with those points. We believe that we didn't get some of those points because there was a lack of collaboration. There was collaboration in this House, but there wasn't collaboration at the state level in terms of doing the application. And we really would like to see this body, if it's possible, to enforce some collaboration at the state level for any progression that we do there or any other changes. And the last item that I will address is you will be addressing it in your next committee, and that's the effects or the staffing flexibility that we're talked about. And when you do your analysis, if you can look at the constitutional requirement, the constitutional protection of those public employees, and we believe that some of the proposals are actually eliminating those constitutional protections. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I wanted to highlight the fact that Public Advocates and our community partners was one of the entities, was one of the coalitions that had written to the Secretary of Education to ask that office to scrutinize carefully the state's maintenance of effort waiver, and those partners are grassroots groups: PICO California, Californians for Justice, the Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment, the Bay Area Parent Leadership Action Network, and Youth Together. We were very disturbed by the statement made yesterday in the press release from the administration about how we were, or the folks that were raising this issue were trying to undermine the state's efforts in obtaining federal dollars. And that's why I made the statement earlier about trying to shoot the messenger, because it's not their fault. They did not cause the problem. And to the extent that the Secretary believes that the maintenance of effort waiver is going to be granted, we are not that confident. The Secretary Duncan does not have the authority to change the law in ARA that says what the requirements are for the application to waive the maintenance of effort. Now, if the guidance says that appropriations and revenues can be used interchangeably, that can only be the case when the expenditures or appropriations are a proxy for the revenues. And in this case, we don't believe that that is so. We are not as confident, and therefore we think that that issue should still be an issue that the legislature address. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who would like to comment? Well, you would? Thank you. Okay. I thank you so much for all of your comments, and let me just suggest that between now and the next meeting that you also try to get as many opportunities to talk to other members in the legislature, not just, these committee members, so that they too can be informed of the gravity of this situation. And that would help us out a lot. So between now and April 6th, if you could do that for me, I would really appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll see you in April. Meeting's adjourned.